And now on Book TV, we're live with author and journalist Matt Taibbi. Mr. Taibbi is a contributor at Rolling Stone magazine and also the author of 7 books, including The Great Derangement, Griftopia, and his most recent, Insane Clown President, Dispatches from the 2016 Circus.
Matt Taibbi, in your most recent book, Insane Clown President, you write about President Trump, quote, "He's no ordinary con man. He's way above average, and the American political system is his easiest mark ever."
Yeah, well, this was that was early in the campaign. I think that was in March of 2016. So it was just around the time when he was sewing up the Republican nomination, and the purpose of that article, because this is a compilation of articles, this book, was sort of to try to explain the Trump phenomenon to people who were, for the first time, having to take it seriously and having to try to come to grips with the fact that this was happening. And so, I took a kind of a different approach to Trump and tried to really listen to what his supporters were saying and try to focus on what he was doing. My take on him was that he was a brilliant media manipulator, and that he was perfectly suited to play on all the weaknesses of the American political media, and that turned out to be true. I wish I had stuck to my guns in that piece, because I thought that he was going to be president there, and then later on in the book, I didn't believe that. So.
Well, the day after the election, you wrote, "I did not see Donald Trump coming."
Right.
Everybody wrote that, though, didn't they?
Well, they did, yeah. I mean, it's funny. I did see a long time ago that we were going to have a problem with this sort of post-factual media atmosphere, and for which Trump was perfectly suited. I even wrote a book about it a long time ago called The Great Derangement. But I never saw Donald Trump specifically. I mean, he was a unique character, and I think what was unique about him was his insight was that the American presidential election was basically just a big reality show, but it was a bad reality show with bad characters, and he made it an engrossing, impossible to miss reality show, and he was perfectly suited for the medium.
Well, along that line, you write that Donald Trump's innovation was to recognize what a bad TV show the campaign was. Any program that tried to make stars out of human sedatives, like Scott Walker and Lindsey Graham, needed new producers and a new script.
Exactly, yeah. And we had, for a long time in the media, been drifting away from substantive policy reporting, and we had more and more played up the storytelling aspect, the production values aspect of it, the pageantry, the debates. They were covered like sports contests. We had pregame shows where people, sort of prognosticated who was going to win. We had these amazing graphics with the dial surveys showing, how the person was doing according to what he or she was saying. And Trump sort of looked at that format and he said, I think internally, he said, wouldn't it be amazing if you put like a professional reality actor in the middle of this and took advantage of all this stagecraft? And that's what he did. I think a lot of the professional politicians, they're good enough on camera. I think they're able to deliver a speech that's been composed for them by their staff, but they're not able to improvise and do what Trump does and attract attention to the degree that he's able to do.
Well, when you were covering this for Rolling Stone, did you develop a respect for his campaign style or his ability to get votes?
Respect is an odd word. I definitely understood and appreciated what he was doing. I think I saw early on that Trump was operating on a different level from the other candidates. I mean, there's a scene that I describe in the book where we're at Plymouth State University in New Hampshire, and the press is always in the middle of the hall, right? We're roped off. We're behind a rope line, and there's these risers, and the cameramen are standing there. And Trump had started to make us part of the act. What he would do is he would, in the middle of his speech, he would interrupt himself and say, "Look at these jerks, these vultures. They hate me. They've never traveled so far for an event. They didn't believe I could do this well." and the crowd would physically turn toward us, and sometimes they would start to boo and hiss or throw things, and it got very menacing. And to me, it was incredible because Trump was taking something that was incredibly boring, the American political stump speech, which is usually this very lifeless event with this very scripted, careful kind of delivery. And he turned it into this immediate, physical, menacing, WWE-style performance. And it was very memorable for people. You could see that they left the hall, sort of worked up into a lather. And that was very unusual for a political event. And it was hard not to miss how effective that was going to be.
You relate the story on Election Day that you were standing at Trump Tower and somebody walked up to you and asked if you were a reporter.
Right, yeah. I forget what he said exactly, but I think he swore at me. And when I said yes, I mean, I had a lot of experiences like that on the trail this year. And this, to be fair, had been happening for quite a long time before Trump even came on the scene. Reporters had been more and more unpopular over the years. And Trump, he used our unpopularity in a really interesting way because being a billionaire from New York, he theoretically had a huge accessibility problem with ordinary people in quote-unquote flyover country. But what he did is he made a common enemy out of the media, and he presented us as the elitist, upper class enemy. And what he basically said is we both hate these people, and that was his link to the common man, basically. And so that trick of using us, of bringing us into the speech and making us characters in the story was incredibly effective for him. We solved his accessibility problem, I thought.
You called the American political system an easy mark. What do you mean by that?
Well, again, for example, what Trump did, our political system, or especially our system of political media, is set up in a way that's totally irrational and doesn't work well for the body politic. We're a commercial system of media, which means that almost all the people who are covering the presidential election, they need to get ratings and subscriptions and eyeballs and hits in order to make money. And so anybody who does those things, who gets ratings for the media, is going to have a massive advantage over anybody else. It doesn't matter what your policies are. If you're like Donald Trump and you're making money for the networks, they're going to cover you more. And that was a major factor early in the race, I think. There was a statistic that Trump got 23 times the amount of TV coverage that Bernie Sanders did. And that wasn't for any substantive reason. It was because Trump was making the TV stations and the newspapers and the magazines money. And that vulnerability that we had to somebody who was a good commercial vehicle made it very easy for somebody like Trump to come in and just sort of take over the entire spectacle.
What's it like to travel in the presidential campaign reporting bubble?
It's a very difficult and frustrating assignment. The first time I did it for a long stretch was in 2004. And you're basically stuck in the same environment with the same people over and over and over again for days and days and weeks on end. And especially in the later stages of the campaign, when the Secret Service gets involved, you're literally trapped in this environment. You can't leave the rope line. You have to stay with the same people and talk to them, and you're stuck with the candidate, the candidate's aides, and other reporters, and they're the only people you're getting information from. And so what happens in this environment, and I think this was a big factor in what happened with Trump, is that you don't spend a lot of time talking to actual people, and you miss a lot of important phenomena that are going on out there. And we get our information from things like polls. That tells us what's going on, and that's how we take the temperature of the people. But it's not an accurate way of kind of discerning what's going on. And that kind of bubble can be very stifling and suffocating and strange also. It's a weird atmosphere to live in for a long time.
Now, reading your most recent couple of books, tell me if I'm wrong about this, but can you draw a direct line from Howard Dean to Ron Paul to Dennis Kucinich to Donald Trump?
I think so, yeah. I mean, they were all protest candidates, right, to begin with. The difference was that in the old days, the press had the power to kind of take these, these protest candidates and kind of marginalize them, right? If we thought, if the sort of establishment media collectively decided that a person like Dennis Kucinich was not a fit for the presidency, they would just describe him as not really a candidate. And it would be subtle sometimes and unsubtle other times. And sometimes it would be, the candidate would be way at the edge in the debate. Other times they would describe the person as a fringe candidate in the text. Other times they would just simply not cover the speeches. And they would signal to audiences who's the real candidate and who isn't the real candidate, right? So we had the front runners, and these are the sort of curiosities. What happened this time around was that there was so much animosity towards the system and towards the establishment media and toward this whole kind of beltway complex king-making group that decided who gets to be president and who doesn't get to be president, that the voters poured all their energy into candidates like Trump and Bernie Sanders, whose main selling point was, I don't belong to that club, right? I mean, that's what they did. They stood up in front of audiences and said, look, these people over here, they want to tell you who your president is going to be, and I'm defying that, and vote for me. And people flocked to those candidacies. So in the old days, yeah, I mean, I watched as the press basically tore apart candidates like Dean and Kucinich and also Ron Paul. And they tried to do it to Trump this time, except that he defied the instinct. You know, when we tried to get rid of him, he just wouldn't have it, and he wouldn't exit the stage.
Do you feel that Rolling Stone and yourself are part of the mainstream media?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. We've been around for so long that we're, I guess you would call us legacy media now. We're not corporate media. I think that's an important distinction. You know, we're privately owned, but you know, our coverage is kind of a tradition now. It's been around for 50 years, and you wouldn't describe us as you know, a threadbare alternative media publication anymore. I think that would be an inaccurate description. So we're somewhere in between, I would say.
If somebody went back and read Hunter S. Thompson from 1972, could they relate to it today?
Absolutely. Hunter Thompson's books are timeless, and they you know, I think of them more as being like great works of fiction than I do. You know, journalism becomes irrelevant in a very short period of time. It's pretty hard to read, you know, journalism 50, 60 years later and really get into it. But Hunter Thompson's books are like great novels. You know, the Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, I always think of as, and I wrote this once for one of the introductions to one of those books, that it reminded me of a book like The Castle or The Trial, you know, because it's this incredible story of this guy kind of searching for meaning and justice in this horrible construction of fakeness and lies and treachery and with these awful villains populating the landscape, and of course he's never quite able to get there, you know, to find happiness and truth and validation. It's just, those books are incredible to me. I think they'll last for another 100, 200 years.
Well, let's go back to 2009 in your book, The Great Derangement. You write in there that we were really losing faith in our political and national institutions at that point.
Yeah, no, this is something that I saw a long time ago and worried about a lot, that there was a trend on both the left and the right. And unfortunately, in America, we have to use these catchphrases like left and right because there's no other shorthand for our politics. I think it's inaccurate sometimes, but we have to. But people were increasingly, I think, tuning out the quote-unquote mainstream media. They were going and seeking out their own stranger, sometimes more conspiratorial media sources. You know, the internet is an incredible invention, but one of the things it's also really good at doing is matching people with their opinions, right? So when people read the news these days, instead of just turning on ABC, CBS, or NBC like they did in the 70s, now they can kind of craft their own realities. They can say, well, these are the 5 publications that describe the world in a way that I agree with. And they go onto the internet and they read those 5 things, and that's how they get their news. And I think what started to happen at the end of the 2000s was that people were beginning to retreat into their own camps, and they increasingly didn't have a common set of facts that we were debating, and that I think was the precursor to this election, where we just couldn't agree on what the facts were.
Is that a negative?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a bad thing. It's a bad thing when the entire society can't even agree on the terms of an argument, right? I mean, we don't really debate each other, on issues or policies anymore. We disagree on the literal facts of the argument, right? And that is a very difficult place for us to be. If we can't even agree on what happened, then it becomes very, very difficult for people to come to any kind of rapprochement about anything more substantive than that. And this has been going on for a while now, and I think it's a result of the sort of fracturing of the media landscape, which is only getting more and more fractured as time goes on. I think now you rarely see a news organization that tries to reach the entire population. We go demographic hunting now, is what we do. We say, here are our readers or viewers, and we're going to craft the news for that audience, and they're going to love us, and these people won't. And that's unfortunate.
And in fact, in a recent Rolling Stone column, the title of it, you wrote, "Roger Ailes was one of the worst Americans ever."
Yeah. Well, I was trying to. So Roger Ailes died, and getting back to Hunter Thompson, I was thinking about his famous obituary of Nixon, which an obituary can be a really interesting thing to write. And I always remembered what he said about Nixon, that he was so crooked that he needed servants to help him unscrew his pants in the morning. So I was trying to do something similar for Roger Ailes, but Roger Ailes, to me was a main driver of this phenomenon of let's target a demographic, let's give them news that they like, and let's forget about these other people over here. And he talked about it. He said, my audience is age 55 to dead. They don't even want to hear about working women or liberals. They just don't want them to exist. And they crafted a news program that was for that audience, and that started us down the road of this divided media landscape, I think, where we're basically we're a population that's split into camps, and we each have our own news sources, and we don't agree on anything. And I think he was a pioneer in that factor.
But Matt Taibbi, to go back to what you called the 70s, and when we all listened to the same news, was it good that NBC, ABC, and CBS essentially in many ways controlled what we heard, what we thought?
No, I mean, look, it was an information monopoly. I read Manufacturing Consent when I was a young person, and I totally agree with the premise of the book, which is that it's very easy to control the opinions of the population if you only have a few media sources, and they were almost entirely simpatico. They were always in line with the policy objectives of the kind of permanent government of the United States, and all that stuff was tremendously negative. It wasn't diverse, I mean, I grew up in the media. My father was in the media, and it was a very different kind of news landscape. The only thing I'm saying that I would say in its favor was that they had a different attitude towards the purpose of the news back then. So the original conception of how the news was supposed to work was, if you go back to the Telecommunications Act of the 30s, the idea was the government would lease the airwaves to these private companies, and in exchange, these private companies were supposed to provide a public service in the form of meaningful news. And so they were supposed to make their money doing, entertainment or sports, and then news was supposed to be a loss leader, and it didn't have to be profitable, and they were only there to, in their minds, to present something that was factual and useful to the public. And even though it was incredibly biased and led us into wars like Vietnam and excluded lots of voices, it's still there was an urge there to try to get the story correct that isn't necessarily true now. Now I think we're basically crafting an entertainment product for people, and people consume the news as the same way they consume entertainment, which is unfortunate.
Back to the Great Derangement from 2009. The derangement that I describe in this book kicked off when Americans finally figured out that they'd been betrayed by their mainstream political system, but still failed to abandon that old paradigm completely.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't like we had a revolution, right? I mean, I think there was a frustration with people. They didn't trust their politicians. They didn't trust the media, but they didn't have an alternative that they particularly trusted either. So there was just a lot of kind of incoherent frustration and anger out in the population that was kind of looking for an outlet. And I think that left us ripe for things like what happened last year with Donald Trump. I mean, there was just an enormous number of people who were discontent, and they were looking for any kind of change, almost irrespective of what the change was. We saw these amazing polls last year that 2 out of 3 people favored a new direction, and they didn't care what the direction was. And that hugely favored somebody like Trump. He came in, and his main argument to people was, whatever you think of me, I'm not what you've experienced before, and that was very attractive to people. Because
you were critical many times in your writing about Donald Trump, did people assume that you supported Hillary Clinton?
Well, that's unfortunately a consequence of how, again, how Americans consume the media now. It's assumed that if you write something negative about one party that you must support the other party. And this, again, is a consequence of that politicized media that, I think that people like Roger Ailes pioneered. If you are saying something negative about the Clintons, that therefore you must be a conservative. And that, unfortunately, is this kind of materialist view of what news is, as opposed to just being, sometimes people will have negative feelings about both candidates, or they're just trying to be objective and trying to call things as they are. It's not necessarily a political act to cover somebody in a positive or a negative way.
From Insane Clown President, by the way, where did the name of that book come from?
Well, there's a band called Insane Clown Posse that, I was trying to come up with something that was hanging around Donald Trump for a year makes you not want to be subtle in your marketing ideas. So that was just that, yeah.
Who did the drawing on the front?
Of Insane Clown President? That's Victor Juhas. He's the illustrator for Rolling Stone. He and I, he's amazing. He and I have worked together for over a decade now, and he has the same basically disturbed sense of humor that I do. So we had a lot of fun during the campaign.
And from that book, the Clintons probably should have left politics the moment they decided they didn't care what the public thought about how they made their money.
Yeah, well, I thought that was an amazing detail in some of the reporting that's come out, among other things, in books like Shattered. They describe this moment where Hillary Clinton essentially said, when she was trying to decide whether or not to accept what ultimately turned into over $100 million in speaking fees by taking this tour of all the various banks and big corporations, she said, they're going to write negative things about me, whatever I do. All right, and that was the substance of the quote. I can't remember exactly what she said, but I think that's when you're in that place as a politician, and you're basically saying it doesn't matter what I do anymore. People are going to hate me no matter what. Then what that basically means is that in my mind, that means you're no longer really worrying about what the public thinks about you, which I think is a dangerous place for a politician to be.
Good afternoon and welcome to Book TV on C-SPAN 2. This is our monthly in-depth program. This is where we invite one author on to talk about his or her body of work. And this month from our New York studio, we have Rolling Stone correspondent and author Matt Taibbi. Mr. Taibbi is the author of several books. His first one came out in 2000. It's called The Exile: Sex, Drugs, and Libel in the New Russia. Spanking the Donkey: Dispatches from the Dumb Season came out in 2005. Smells Like Dead Elephants: Dispatches from a Rotting Empire came out in 2007. The Great Derangement, which we've talked about a little bit, A Terrifying True Story of War, Politics, and Religion, 2009. His most recent books are Griftopia, a story of bankers, politicians, and the most audacious power grab in American history, 2011. The Divide came out in 2014, American Injustice in the Age of the Wealth Gap. And finally, this past year, Insane Clown President, Dispatches from the 2016 Circus. This is your chance to call in and talk with Mr. Taibbi about his work, about politics. Here's how you can do so. 202 is the area code, 748-8200. For those of you in the East and Central time zones, 748-8201. If you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Now, if you can't get through on the phone lines, still want to make a comment, we've got some social media ways for you to get through, including Twitter. @BookTV is our Twitter handle. If you send a tweet and use that, we'll be able to see it and maybe use it. You can also make a comment on our Facebook page, facebook.com/BookTV. If you go down, you'll see a piece there with Mr. Taibbi, and you can just make a comment underneath there. We'll get those comments on the air as well. And finally, you can send an email to booktv@cspan.org. And we'll begin taking those calls in just a few minutes. Mr. Taibbi, how'd you get into this business?
Well, it's the family business, actually. My father, almost everybody I knew growing up was a reporter. My father was a news reporter starting from the age of 18. And
that's Mike Taibbi.
Mike Taibbi, yeah. He worked here in New York at WCBS and WNBC for a long time. He's just sort of retiring now. He does a little work for PBS, but he was in the business for 50 years. My stepmother was an anchor at CNN for a while, business anchor.
And what's her name?
Beverly Shook. And a lot of, my family friends growing up, they worked in places like the International Herald Tribune. And so my childhood was basically like the movie Anchorman. I spent most of my, formative years in local television affiliates with guys with bad facial hair and stuff like that. And so I actually never wanted to do this for a living, but I wanted to be a novelist. But when it turned out that my fiction was pretty bad, I sort of fell back into the family business, and so I've been here ever since.
When did you know you were a writer?
I always wanted to be a writer from the age of maybe 11 or 12. I think. That was never a question in my mind. I had a really deep love of books. When I was growing up, I was an only child. We moved a lot. Books were, a tremendous solace to me. I was depressed a lot. And then, when I started to learn how to write, I became really obsessed with the idea. Writing is almost like a religion. If you really get into it, it's you can never really complete the task of being perfect at it. So you have to constantly try to practice getting better and better and better. And I became really addicted to it at a very young age. I wanted to be a comic novelist. My heroes were all funny writers. People like Saki and Nikolai Gogol and Bulgakov, who wrote Heart of a Dog and Master and Margarita, books like that. Catch-22, Evelyn Waugh. So these were the things that I wanted. That's what I wanted to do when I grew up, and I spent a lot of my early years in my teens trying to do that kind of thing, and it just didn't work out. But journalism has been great in a different way. I think it's an amazing profession because it allows you to see the whole world and meet this extraordinary range of people. And it's been great in a way that probably was more fulfilling than sitting at home and being a fiction writer would have been.
You said that you were depressed a lot. Why?
I don't know. Some people are just depressive. But
Do you think it's organic?
I think it probably is. Yeah, I think most people who have that problem would tell you that it's just a chemical thing in your brain. Interestingly, a lot of the people who were kind of my heroes also had the same problem. I remember reading about, Gogol, who was a famous Russian writer, and he was a terrible depressive, and he conquered it by sitting at home and trying to think of the funniest things that he could all day long, and then he would write those things down, and that's how he got through it. And that was something that I did a lot in my teen years. I tried to write funny stories and things like that, and that was a way of kind of making sense of the world.
On your bio, it says that you were the sports editor for the Moscow Times. How did that come about?
Yeah, so one of my first jobs was I was living in Russia. I studied in Russia in 1990 and 91. So I was there when it was communist, and then I was there. I went home. They had a revolution. Then I came back, and I loved it over in Russia so much. One of the reasons actually was that, as a young, often depressed teenager and 20-something, America was a very difficult place for me to be because there was enormous pressure in America to be successful and happy, and you turn on the television, everyone has perfect teeth and they're all, thrilled. In Russia, everybody was depressed. When I got there, people were drab, nobody had nice clothes, and I thought, I fit right in here. This is perfect, So when I went to study there, I just didn't come home. And before long, I ended up needing a job, and so I started stringing for various newspapers, and sooner or later, I ended up meeting the people in Moscow. They had an expatriate newspaper there, and since I had a sports background, they gave me the sports editor's job, so that's how I did that.
How did you end up playing professional basketball in Mongolia?
So I had played basketball in college in the States, for Bard College here in New York. I'm an okay, Division III basketball player basically, and I played a lot of street ball in Moscow, and I was out at Moscow State University one day, and I met this kid. We were playing a game 3-on-3, and he told me he was from Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital of Mongolia. And he told me about a league they had there, the NBA, the Mongolian Basketball Association. He said it was the only league in the world that had NBA rules outside of America. And it just sounded like so much fun. I went into work the next day and quit my job. And I packed up my stuff. I got on the Trans-Siberian Railroad for Ulaanbaatar. And when I got there, I got a tryout and got on one of the teams. And I would have stayed there for a long time. I was really having a great time, except I got quite ill and ended up having to come home. It was cool. I was like a sports star there, and people would recognize me on the streets and stuff. It was great. I was known as the Mongolian Rodman, believe it or not.
Matt Taibbi, it's been written about, and you've written about your drug use. And why is that important for us to know?
I don't know if it's important for anybody to know. I just didn't particularly feel a need to deny it. I think, I had a period there in Russia. We had a newspaper called The Exile, which was like a nightlife guide, and we were young and in a town that was very much like the Wild West. Communism had just collapsed. It was crazy at the time, and we were doing a lot of crazy things. And I did have a pretty serious drug problem at one point, and it's not that I particularly want anybody to know about it, but when somebody asked, I'll admit to it.
You've been with Rolling Stone since 2005. Your book, Griftopia, came out in 2011. And in that book, you write that Alan Greenspan's rise to the top is one of the great scams of our time.
Yeah, so Alan Greenspan was a character. I originally had planned on doing just a 2,000-word little section on him because he was so important to the whole history of the modern financial services industry. his attitude. You know, he has this philosophy that's derived a lot from Ayn Rand. You know, he was an acolyte of hers, and he was fascinating to me as a character because he was very famous for being this great predictor of economic events. But when I actually went back and looked, it turned out that he had been wrong about almost everything that he'd ever predicted, and so he was mostly, you know, sort of like a lot of famous hangers-on who hang around rock bands or other celebrities. He was famous for being somebody who was really good at telling politicians what they wanted to hear, and that gift of being like a president whisperer, I think, really was what allowed him to serve in the capacity that he did for so long. It wasn't that he was so great an economist; he really wasn't. It was just more that he was a very skilled politician, and that was what I was trying to demonstrate in that book.
And The Divide came out in 2014. In the end, the one bank to get thrown on the dock was not a Wall Street firm, but one housed in the opposite direction, a little to the north, a tiny family-owned community bank in Chinatown called Abacus Federal Savings Bank.
Yeah, in fact, there's a movie out about it now called Abacus, Small Enough to Jail. This is an incredible story because it's a tiny, sort of family-owned Chinese immigrant bank in Chinatown. It's stuck between two noodle shops, and it was the only bank in America to be indicted after the financial crisis. And they were indicted because of a series of very small improprieties that they themselves reported to the authorities. They were eventually prosecuted for defrauding Fannie Mae, but Fannie Mae never suffered a single cent of loss in any of those transactions. So what I was trying to show in that book was, you know, here you have this tiny regional bank that's surrounded by all these behemoth financial institutions that later settled for billions of dollars for committing crimes on massive scales, far beyond what Abacus had ever did, but none of them were criminally prosecuted. And that was because we have this new doctrine in America, which is too big to fail, and too big to jail. We have openly said, people like former Attorney General Eric Holder have said that that they were reluctant to prosecute certain companies because they were worried about the quote-unquote collateral consequences and what that might do to the larger economy. And so, you know, the converse of that is if we're afraid to prosecute a big bank because we're concerned that it's going to upset the economy, well, that means that you have to be small enough to be able to prosecute, right? I mean, so that's what happened in the case of Abacus. They found a bank that was just small enough to prosecute. And so they indicted them, but very recently they were all found not guilty, and so it's an amazing story, and I highly recommend everybody watch the movie too. It's an uplifting story.
Well, July 9, 2013, you were in the courtroom when Cyrus Vance Jr. was the prosecutor, and essentially these people were marched through in chains.
Right, yeah, and some of them had actually already been arraigned, and they brought them back a second time for a photo op. And you think about this, like, you know, not one of the major bankers who got in trouble or who were accused of wrongdoing after 2008, none of them had to appear so much as appear in a courtroom. You know, all of these big deals between, you know, the settlements between companies like J.P. Morgan Chase or Goldman Sachs, they were all done in back rooms, and there was just an exchange of money. Nobody had to sit in the dock. Nobody had to be publicly humiliated. But when you had this small immigrant bank, they needed a photo opportunity. So what did? They indicted a bunch of people, and they literally got them in a chain gang and dragged them into the courtroom. And you know, the excuse the prosecutors gave later was that wasn't up to us, that was up to the bailiffs in the courthouse. But clearly it was a political thing, and it was done. And the purpose of telling that story was to show the dichotomy in how we treat different kinds of people. You know, when we're talking about a group of people who don't have power, influence, or connections, we treat them one way, and when they do have connections, you know, they never see the inside of a courtroom.
And I sensed a feeling of outrage on your part reading this book.
Of course, and I think outrage is an important component of being a reporter. I mean, I think if you aren't in touch with what's outrageous, then it's very difficult to do this job. And you have to maintain your sense of that throughout the years. One of the things that happens to people who are in the press for a long, long time is you get outrage fatigue after a while. You've seen so much horrible stuff and so much bad behavior that you stop responding to things in the way that a normal person would. And that's something you have to guard against as you get older. You know, this feeling of, you know, I've seen that before. You have to continually say, this is not acceptable, you know, and find ways to get upset about it.
From the divide, we have a profound hatred of the weak and the poor, and a corresponding groveling terror before the rich and successful, and we're building a bureaucracy to match those findings.
Yeah, what I was trying to say there was that the underlying political, what drives the policies that lead to mass incarceration, to, you know, things like stop and frisk, community policing, where we're stopping 500,000, 600,000 people a year, emptying their pockets and throwing people in jail for nickel bags and dime bags on the one hand. And then we take people like HSBC, you know, one of the world's largest banks that gets caught laundering $800 million for narco-terrorists in you know, Central and South America, and you know, we don't even prosecute those people. They you know, they just pay a fine and walk away. I think what's underlying the policy divide there is that we feel like X group of people, we worship the people who make money. We have a reverence and admiration for people who are quote unquote wealth creators. And the people who we see as parasites and nuisances, well, you know, we have no sympathy for them whatsoever. They belong in jail. You know, I had an experience that was really eye-opening for me when I was writing that book. And I asked a prosecutor in Washington, I said, how can you let these guys who laundered $800 million in drug money, how can you let them walk and not go to jail? If we're sending people to jail for possession, you know, on the other hand, these guys got to go sit in jail. And what he said to me was, have you been to a prison? Those places are dangerous, you know? And he didn't mean it in an ironic way. What he was really trying to say without really, you know, admitting it was, I just don't see that kind of offender as deserving jail, you know, no matter what he or she does. But these offenders, well, you know, they grow up in these bad neighborhoods and they're used to that kind of thing. So of course we send them to jail. And that's what I was trying to get at, this psychological split that we have, where we just have this hidden hostility towards people who, you know, are poor and without means, and we fear and revere these other people. And not to go on about this too much, but you know, I had an experience in Russia that gave me some insight into this. When I was a student in the Soviet Union, when I went to school in the morning, I would see these kids selling blue jeans and rabbit hats and stuff like that. And of course, that was commerce, so that was against the law in communist Russia. And every now and then, those kids would disappear for 3 or 4 weeks. You know, they'd do a little bit in jail, and they would come back. Meanwhile, the people they were selling to, you know, they would sell socks and T-shirts and clothes to the party members who were the running the school. You know, nobody ever did anything to them, and that was because it was so ingrained in Soviet society that the party members don't get in trouble, but these people do get in trouble. And I think that kind of unspoken split is where we are as a country, and it's just hard to reconcile with.
It's a class split?
Yeah, I think it's a class split. It goes beyond that too, though. I mean, clearly race is a huge factor also. You know, I think white audiences probably wouldn't want to admit it, but they would look differently at a poor black person who gets busted with a bag of weed in his or her pocket than they would a white kid who gets busted for the same thing. They would say, oh, he's just going through a phase, is what they would say. All kids will be kids. But they would say something very different, about a black kid who gets pulled over and has drugs found on him. So I think it's race, it's class, it's all those things.
Before we leave the divide, you also visited California and went through their welfare system.
Right.
What was that experience?
Well, I mean, again, what I was trying to show is because a lot of the big banks and financial companies that I'd covered, a lot of them were technically guilty of crimes like fraud, right? I would talk to whistleblowers and things like that, and they would explain to me, like, look, if you wanted to prosecute these people, here's the statute that they're guilty of, right? It would always be like some kind of fraud statute. So I looked at how they treated those people, and then I wanted to see how they treated people who committed crimes like welfare fraud. And what that experience was like was, I would talk to people who were on welfare, and they would tell me stories about how you'd have to fill out this gigantic sort of complex of forms just to get the aid in the first place. And then what they would do is they would check every single item that you entered like on a monthly basis. And they had, this whole network of computers is constantly searching your record. And if there's any inconsistency at all, they automatically generate a fraud case, and you will either be prosecuted for it, or you'll have your benefits taken away, your family's benefits will be taken away. They can enter your home at any time. There's a Supreme Court case that says that they can do that, if once you're taking public aid. So I was just trying to show that, again, this dichotomy in how we treat people. Like you couldn't just go and seize the books of a company that's committed, fraud, like a subprime mortgage fraud. They would treat them very differently than they would treat somebody who committed welfare fraud. And they would punish them much more severely for the welfare fraud than for the $100 million fraud. So I was just trying to show how even getting that aid is a constant struggle to avoid being prosecuted for misusing the funds, whereas people who enjoy the largesse, for instance, of the Federal Reserve, banking window, they're borrowing billions of dollars a month to these gigantic banks. The government doesn't do anything. There's no surveillance or anything like that in that area. So again, I was just trying to show the differing attitudes towards these two classes of people.
Do you hear from your Rolling Stone readers?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I hear from people on Twitter, and I make it a point to read, if anybody writes hate mail or a critical letter, if somebody takes the time to actually sit down and write me a letter, I always read it. I think it's important to read your hate mail. Not everybody does it. I don't block anybody on social media. I think often, that's one of the ways you get better as a writer is you listen to your readers, and sometimes they tell you, this thing that you tried didn't work, it wasn't funny, it sucked, and you have to listen to that. So,
Matt Taibbi, is it easy, or is one susceptible to being brought into the groupthink when you're traveling on a campaign and you're in this bubble with other reporters? Is there a groupthink susceptibility?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's a social thing, it's a class thing. Again, just to talk about the differences between when I was a kid and around the people who my father worked with, reporting was more like a trade than a profession back then. There were a lot of people who were in the press who didn't go to college. They were like this. They got in sort of via the Seymour Hersh method. They would be copy boys at age 16, and they would just work their way through. And it was a job more like being a plumber or an electrician than it was like being a doctor or a lawyer. And back then, I think those people didn't have any affinity for politicians or the rich. They tended to have this kind of like stick it to the man attitude. Of course, it was a far less diverse group of people on the one hand, but they were, in terms of class, they were very much more a working class group of people back in the day. Now, when you're on the campaign plane, you see a lot of people who are like me. They come from privileged backgrounds. They went to really good schools. They tend to be white and well off. And they get into this business very often because they're attracted to the idea of being near power and powerful people. They want to hang out after the speech with, the candidate's aides or the candidate, his or herself. And you would never have seen that 30 or 40 years ago, this desire to be behind the rope line with the politician. Back then, the politician was kind of the enemy, And what I've definitely seen lately is that socially, the media and the people they're covering are the same people. You know, after the campaigns are over, they hang out with each other. You know, the political strategists and the aides and the pollsters, they go to the same bars, and Adams Morgan and the Upper West Side, and I don't know that that's a healthy thing. I mean, it may be, it may not be, but it's certainly different from what it used to be.
In your book, Insane Clown President, you're very critical of the mannequin. What happened?
Oh, the Hillary Clinton, the mannequin video. Yeah, I mean, I think that might have been a little gratuitous. You know, at the time, this was right after the election I wrote that, and I remember looking at that, the mannequin challenge, I think they called it, right? And it was a bunch of people who were on the plane together, and it was press, and the Clintons' aides, and the Clintons, and I think John Bon Jovi was on that, in that shot as well. And what happens, again, when you're in that environment for a long time, it becomes romanticized. Hey, we're all on this adventure together, you know, isn't it cool that we're all hanging out together, and there are celebrities in the plane, and we're all friends, and that congenial atmosphere, you see it in books like Primary Colors, right, or movies like that, where it's just this, they kind of lionize the whole idea of the roving campaign. But they were, you know, there was this disaster looming all outside the plane, and they were completely unaware of it happening. I mean, they probably all should have been panicking instead of playing that goofy game. I don't know. I mean, I've had it's not exclusive to the Clintons. I've seen that kind of thing in a couple of different campaigns. I was in a plane in the Obama campaign once where I came in and I noticed that all the reporters had taken photos of themselves with Barack Obama, and then posted it on the, you know, they would stick them on the side of the plane in the press section. And, you know, I liked Barack Obama, I voted for him, but, you know, I thought that was kind of a bad look for us. You know, we didn't want to be acting like groupies, you know, even just superficially it looked bad, you know. And so I think that's what I was trying to get to with that mannequin challenge is, you know, even if we do like the people we're hanging out with on the plane, we have to kind of pretend at least that we're separate, you know, maintain that distance, because it's a bad look when we get caught, you know, making a mistake like we made in this race. We got it entirely wrong from start to finish, and that's bad for us.
In your columns, you've also been critical of Tom Friedman, the New York Times columnist.
Yeah, I mean, I actually kind of enjoy reading Tom Friedman. I mean, what I've really gotten after with Tom Friedman is his writing style. You know, he's famous for mixing metaphors, and some of them are so strange that it's almost like a psychedelic experience to try to follow what he's trying to say. You know, he compared once the Iraq War to driving a car with no steering wheel. He's like, sometimes you just have to throw the wheel out, you know, but you can't drive a car with no steering wheel, you know what I mean? Or he'll say, you know, he has a famous thing, the rule of holes, he says. You know, when you're in a hole that's too deep, you should stop. When you're in 3 holes, you should stop digging. Like, you can't be in 3 holes at once, you know, and there's just all these bizarre images that are kind of mismatched in his writing. And I actually really enjoy writing it, and I met him once, and he was very gracious to me, and I felt really bad about saying negative things about him. So it's not directed at him as a person. I just find his writing really interesting. What's the origin of the name Taibbi? Taibbi is it's a Sicilian name of Arabic origin. I'm neither of those things. My father is adopted. He is Filipino and Hawaiian, and he was adopted by a Sicilian family here in New York. And so that's where that name comes from. Matt Taibbi is our guest, Rolling Stone correspondent and author. His most recent book is Insane Clown President. Here's what the cover looks like. Phone numbers to dial in, 202-748-8200 if you live in the East and Central Time Zone,
202-748-8201 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific. And Tyler in Marietta, Georgia, you've been very patient. You are on the air, Tyler. Go ahead.
Matt, do you feel that the media is being complicit in the terrorist attacks? The media is acting as, the propaganda arm for the terrorists by providing nonstop coverage of their attacks. I mean, why doesn't the media get this? I know they're probably doing it because they want to generate more, more ratings and generate more profits. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
That's an interesting question, Tyler. I hadn't thought about it from that point of view. Clearly, terrorism doesn't work if nobody sees it. So, on the one hand, there's probably some truth to that, but on the other hand, it would be hugely irresponsible not to cover these things at the same time. So I don't know exactly what the happy medium is there. There may be a way to do it that's less sensational than the way that we do it. Certainly, more people die in domestic murders overwhelmingly than they do in terrorist attacks, but we worry a lot more about terrorism on the news. So that's definitely a consideration. But yeah, clearly, I wouldn't necessarily say that we're complicit in it. I just think there's probably a way that we could do it that wouldn't quite amplify the effect that they're looking for quite as much. Because, to be frank, people are so scared of terrorists now that they've made some crazy political decisions as a result, dating back to 9/11. And a lot of that has to do with the sort of bombardment of coverage that you get whenever there's a terrorist attack. So yeah, that's a good point.
Do you find yourself, when things like what has been happening in London, do you find yourself turning on the TV immediately?
I don't. Again, I lived in Moscow when terrorist attacks were pretty routine. The Chechens were kind of routinely bombing the city. I just missed being in a subway bombing a couple of times, actually. And I don't find that it's something that I have to glue myself to the television to watch. It's a fact of life. I think it's a very complicated political dilemma, but getting myself worked up about it is not. I don't think it's helpful. So but clearly there is something to the idea that scaring people is a way to get them to tune into your network, and terrorists are scary. So there is a commercial motive there, and it might be worth unpacking that a little bit.
Well, I can't find which book or article it is, but you have a quote saying that the best story for CNN is somebody has fallen down the well, and the best story for Fox is that somebody was pushed down the well by a radical Muslim terrorist.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, but the point I was trying to make there is that both the formula in the liberal media and the conservative media, it's basically the same formula. We're both looking for the same kind of sensationalist stories. It's just that the Fox version tends to be tilted in a direction if they can manage it. Their favorite story will tend to involve some kind of political nemesis, whether it's a liberal professor or an Islamic terrorist or God knows who else. But yeah, exactly.
Next call from Matt Taibbi comes from Nancy in Redondo Beach, California. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, good morning, guys. Thank you, Peter, so much, and thanks for C-SPAN. And Matt, I've followed you for a very long time. And my question is that my sense is when a journalist or a reporter is going to write a story or a book, most of the time it's to kind of confirm what they already believe, and they may ignore what they don't want to see or contradicts what they initially believed. And I'm wondering, for you personally, has there been a time where you thought, when you went into a story and you thought it was going to be one way and it turned out to be completely different? And is it possible for reporters and journalists to not be biased? I'll take my answer off the air, and thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Nancy. Great question.
Thank you, Nancy. That's a great question. To answer the last part first, no, I believe that all coverage is biased. I don't think you can have, I think objectivity in the way that they teach it in journalism school is kind of a myth, because every decision you make editorially speaks to your point of view on things. So just to take an example, even if you're looking at the New York Times and they're covering something in that kind of unemotional third-person voice, and they're trying to give equal weight to different points of view, but even the choice of whether to put something on the front page or in the middle, on the top of the page or at the bottom, whether to have a picture or not a picture, whether to make the headline a scare headline or less threatening, all of those things speak to, they're all editorial decisions, and they all speak to what your opinion on the subject is. So I think there's always bias, and there are a lot of different ways to handle it. I try to be just sort of open about it, and when I'm covering something, I'll say, and this is what I think about the subject. In terms of the other thing, about the confirmation bias, which is the sort of the second problem, that is a huge issue in our business because, among other things, now speed is such a factor in how the commercial media works. You have to be as quick as possible in generating your content. And one of the ways you do that is by knowing what you're going to say beforehand. You know, if you're going to do a story on, let's say, middle-class white suburbanites who left the Republican Party to the traditional Republican Party to vote for Donald Trump, well, what you'll do is you'll go to an event, you'll look for people like that, you'll ask them leading questions that tend to confirm your thesis, and then as soon as you get those quotes, you just dump them in the story and you publish it. And that's not a good way to do business. I think it's much better to enter into a subject in a way that's open-ended and that allows you the freedom to kind of go in a different direction. I've definitely had the experience of covering a story and thinking it was going to be one thing and then having it turn out to be something completely different. I've had the experience of expecting somebody to be guilty of something when I started investigating and having it turn out that they weren't and had to abandon the story. You have to have the freedom to not write, too. That's another important thing, and a lot of reporters don't have that freedom. So yeah, I think that's kind of a key thing. Unfortunately, again, because of the way our business is structured, it's just really hard to allow reporters the latitude to kind of go where the facts lead them as opposed to just cranking out content.
Let's hear from Phyllis in Brooklyn, New York. Hi, Phyllis.
Hi, I have a question about health care, specifically the members of Congress. What kind of health care do they have? How much is their deductible and their copay? Do their plans cover abortion and birth control? How old are their children on their health plans? How long do they keep these health plans? Is it for life? And who funds their health plan?
Phyllis, right? That's a great question. I actually don't know the answer to that. I do know that the members of Congress do enjoy a federal health insurance program, or at least they did up until very recently, until the last time I covered the health insurance story. So yeah, we're paying for their health insurance, and that of course adds to the perversity of members of Congress moving to take away health insurance from people. So. But I think that information is easily discoverable if you just go on the internet and look for it.
This is an email question from Flor, F-L-O-R, in California. With your experience in the former Soviet Union, what's your take on the current Putin-Trump bromance and subversion of the U.S. political system? If Trump were a Democratic president, might he be tarred and feathered by the right? Also, what similarities did you find between the Russian and American national characters? So what's your take, first of all?
Yeah, well, so, you know, I've taken a little bit of heat for this, for being kind of a skeptic on this Russia story. And, you know, my concern with this story is not, first of all, I think it's pretty clear I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump. You know, I certainly wouldn't shed a tear if he were impeached. But my concern about the Russia story is that it's been very sloppily reported. It's been reported in a way that lends its people to excesses. Just to give you an example, you know, the Steele dossier that was released, you know, no responsible news outlet would ever touch that. And when BuzzFeed published that, it set in motion a chain of events that I think was very unfortunate, because we, as reporters, we as a rule don't publish unverifiable accusations of crimes against people for the simple reason that we wouldn't want that to happen to us. And so when we did this with Trump, with this dossier that had this explosive set of allegations in it, but was totally unverifiable, now it's all over the internet, and it's we have millions and millions of people who sort of believe implicitly that this thing is true, and it's led to audiences coming to news stories about this with a set of expectations. They already believe a certain set of facts has been confirmed when we don't know for a fact exactly what's happened. This story, I spent months on this, and this is an example of what I was just talking about not writing when you can't find what the truth is. Every time I tried to actually get hold of something concrete with this story, I just kept coming up with dead ends and suppositions and anonymous sources who wouldn't come up with verifiable, concrete information. So I worry a lot about this story. I think it could be a disaster for our system of media if this turns out not to be true, and I just worry that we're getting in over our skis with this thing.
You say you've gotten the treatment, though, from others.
Yeah, well, and this is one of the things that I worry about, which is when people are emotional enough about a story that they attack somebody for, there's a new term out there for people who don't believe the Russia thing. They call them anti-Trumpers, right? And so what they're accusing people of is basically aiding and abetting Donald Trump or the Russians. I've been accused of being a Russian agent, because, among other things, because I lived in Russia for a long time. But what happens when people see that happening to people like me, and even though I may not worry about that criticism, other people might, and they'll think twice about saying, well, I'm not sure about this, and when it silences people, and that's not a positive thing. People become afraid to speak their minds, and these stories generate a momentum. Everybody knows that it's easy to get hits and followers on Twitter by fueling this thing, and they know that the opposite will happen if they express any skepticism about this thing. And that's not a positive situation. You don't want people being afraid to say what they see, and the media in particular. I saw this starting to happen last year before this Russia thing even took place. There was a shift, and there were even people like Jim Rutenberg in the New York Times who wrote about this openly. They said, Trump is such an extreme character, he's such a threat, that we in the media have to rethink our traditional kind of objective posture towards things and start to become advocates and start to think of ourselves as a force that will stop him. And I think a lot of people in our business have adopted that attitude. And what's dangerous about that attitude is that it undercuts our power institutionally in the media. The media derives its power entirely from its independence. If we are seen as being part of the Democratic Party or part of a resistance effort that aids one party over another, then we completely lose our legitimacy. We have to be seen as only being about one thing, and that's the truth, right? And when we're seen as being about something else, then we're useless to people. We don't have any real function in society. We have to be separate. It's kind of like when the Senate, in order to help Barack Obama push through his nominees, they got rid of their ability to filibuster presidential nominees a couple of years ago because they wanted to, end the gridlock in Washington. And that seemed like a great idea to progressives at the time, right? Because it helped people get through and do their work. But look what happened 3 years later. Now the Senate is too weak. The minority party can't filibuster Trump's nominees, and the Senate undercut itself. It undercut its own institutional authority on behalf of somebody else. And the media, I think, is doing that now. By signing on with this kind of resistance effort and making us indistinguishable from that effort, we're losing our power. And we have to be seen as being separate, and that's what I worry about.
Floor, another part of his or her question was differences or similarities, Russian and American characters.
Well, there are a lot of differences and a lot of similarities. I think both countries see their citizens view themselves as, as superpower nations, and they derive incredible pride in the idea that they're different from people who live in small countries that don't affect everything in the world. I remember being in the apartment of a Russian teacher on the day that they dismantled the Soviet map, and they changed the name from the USSR to the CIS. I forget what that even stands for in English, but basically the old Soviet map became much smaller. It was as if the United States became, 23 states instead of 50. And he looked at the new map and he was crying, because he had grown up his whole life with this gigantic 11 time zones expanse of a superpower, and he thought of himself as part of this empire. And now he wasn't anymore, And I think Americans and Russians both share that idea that we are part of the sort of deciding cadre in the world hierarchy. Both countries are heavily militarized. They tend to be much more macho than other countries. In terms of differences, I don't know, that's a long list. Americans are much more conservative, I would say. I don't know. I'll have to think about that one. You have to give me a little bit of time on that.
Well, while you're thinking about that, Matt Taibbi, let's hear from Walter in Cincinnati. Hi, Walter. Go ahead with your question or comment.
Hi, Matt. I'd like to have, well, first of all, I think that you're absolutely right that the media has become a mouthpiece for the Democratic Party, but that's another thing. What I wanted to know is your opinion of the writing of Ali Hirsi Ali, who has written a book, I think it's called Heretic. Her notion is that we will never eliminate the jihadists by trying to kill them all. What we need to do is support the notion of the Islamic world having a reformation similar to what the Christian church did back a ways. They have to get out of being in the 7th century. And your opinion of that, and why that is not talked about. I don't see it on any television. Nobody is talking about the idea of having the Islamic world having a reformation. Thanks.
All right, that's Walter in Cincinnati. Are you familiar with Hirsi Ali?
I'm not. I haven't read Hirsi Ali's book. The only thing I would say to that, Walter, is I have spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I clearly don't agree with the idea of that killing them all is going to solve any kind of problem. I think that we exacerbate the problem when we do that. This is an issue that I agree has to come from a transformation within those societies, and it probably also has something to do with, changing our attitudes towards those societies. I think that we wouldn't have all of those problems if we hadn't had such a powerful and intrusive colonial presence in a lot of those places for so long, and hadn't had an interest in their oil wealth and other issues. So it's definitely a complicated issue, but for sure, dropping bombs is not, to me, the way to go.
This is a tweet from Alan. Could you comment on the phenomena of buyer's remorse as it relates to voters who supported Trump?
Well, I haven't seen a whole lot of data on how many people have that buyer's remorse. I have seen that Trump's approval rating is now down around 39%, which is, of course, lower than a little bit lower than where he was in November. But the Democrats have also seen a significant drop in their approval rating since November. They were at 45, and they're now at 40. So, I think people who voted for Donald Trump, if they weren't turned off to him before November, they're probably not going to be turned off to him. I mean, it would take something extraordinary, like proof of him conspiring with Vladimir Putin or some very, very awful sexual scandal or something like that to really get people to move off their support of him. So it's like fandom. You know, how many people do you know are Minnesota Vikings fans who suddenly stop being Minnesota Vikings fans? That's the way politics is in America now. It's a fanatical kind of a relationship in many cases, and it's hard to break that bond.
Matt Taibbi, you live up here in New York City, and you write for Rolling Stone. What's been the general attitude of your neighbors and friends and people in the city
towards Donald Trump? Well, almost everybody I know is horrified by Donald Trump, and the dichotomy is not that hard to figure out where it is in America. If you look at the map, almost everybody who lives in a big city votes Democrat, and everybody who lives in between the big cities votes Republican. I mean, the maps are incredible. It's seas of red with little dots of blue all over the country. We're really two different countries right now, and we see the world entirely differently. And if you travel in one circle, you're not going to run into a whole lot of Trump supporters. I certainly don't. And again, that probably contributes to why we didn't see it coming. I think most of the people who work in the media, they're like me. They live in New York, LA, and Washington for the most part. They like shows like The Wire and The Americans, and they watch movies with subtitles, and they eat ethnic food and that's how they they don't watch NASCAR. It's a cultural difference. So I think it's going to be very tough for those two Americas to have any kind of exchange with each other.
Did you have any friends or family members that were Trump supporters that just shocked you?
Well, I have some family members who are Trump supporters, but they've been conservatives for quite a long time. So there are a couple of people who I know who didn't vote this time, and that was a little bit shocking. That I think spoke to some frustration probably with the Democratic Party, because these were lifelong Democrats who aren't voting Democratic anymore. But in terms of people who suddenly became Trump supporters, no, I don't know anybody like that. Do you?
This is an email from Mansur Johnson in Tucson, Arizona. Matt, in your recent article on Goldman Sachs' purchase of certificates issued by Venezuela for 32 cents on the dollar, you referred to Venezuelan President Maduro as a dictator. I was shocked you, as a progressive journalist, would use the word dictator, the same characterization of the Venezuelan president that elements in the U.S. government have used ever since Chavez.
Yeah, I heard some pushback on that from some people. I haven't lived in South America. I'm relying on people that I know who cover South American politics and who write to me from South America. My understanding of that situation is, that he essentially canceled elections and has been acting in an undemocratic way. But I admit that there's room for me to learn on that issue. So I'll have to go back and look.
Barry is calling in from Scottsdale, Arizona, and Barry, you're on Book TV with Matt Taibbi.
Hi, Matt. How you doing?
Hi. How are you doing?
Good. I'm doing great. Thanks for being on this show. Two questions, a little bit off the beaten path, not really. One is, in your thinking, how did we get from a presidential candidate like Gary Hart, thoughtful, reflective, to Donald Trump? Seems like a huge leap to me. Second question is, what's your take on President Obama? I heard you say you voted for him. I voted for him too, But, you know, a number of problems we're facing now were allowed to fester under his administration for 8 years. He really didn't deal with them. I mean, there's Syria, there's the racial divide in the country, which is as bad as it's ever been. ISIS, I don't know if he was afraid to deal with them or whatever. What's your take? I really liked him as a human being, but I just don't know as a president if he really did anything. What's your take on those two issues? Thank you. I'll listen.
No, thanks. Well, I wrote a piece about Obama right after the election, and you know, I had been critical of Barack Obama in the last 8 years, mainly because on the subject that I have covered throughout most of his presidency, which is corruption in the financial services sector. You know, he doesn't have a great record there. His administration was mainly known for not winning a single conviction against any senior level executive for any of the corruption that led to the 2008 financial crisis. And so because that was my little bailiwick, you know, I was critical of Barack Obama. I didn't like the fact that he, you know, he ran as an economic progressive, and then when he got elected, he brought in a whole bunch of people from Citigroup basically to run his transition team, and you know, people like Timothy Geithner and Eric Holder were, you know, and Lanny Brewer, who was the assistant attorney general throughout that time. You know, they were corporate lawyers who had long worked for Wall Street. They had all the banks had been their clients, and that came through in a lot of their enforcement decisions. And so just in terms of that, I had always been critical of Obama, but you know, upon reflection, looking back at him, I think history is going to look back at him in a very favorable way, not necessarily because of his policy ideas, because as a progressive person, I think he was a disappointment to a lot of people in a lot of areas, whether it's, you know, the continuation of Guantanamo Bay or the drone bombings or whatever it was. But his demeanor, his composure and his unwillingness to give in to you know, anger and to not give up on whole segments of the society. I was really impressed by what he said after the election, by way of, I think, criticizing Hillary Clinton. You know, one of the things he said was, you know, even in places where I knew I was going to lose, I continued to try to reach you know, people in rural Iowa, and there were places where I instead of losing by 50 points, I only lost by 20 points. And Obama was, what he was saying, it wasn't just a strategic thing that he was talking about. I thought he was saying, basically, you know, we just can't give up on being one whole country. You know, he still tried, no matter how bad the abuse directed toward him was, and there was, you know, just awful, racist, horrible rhetoric, you know, including the birther thing. He never kind of took the bait and made it divisive and vicious. And now when we have, you know, somebody like Trump as president, where, you know, every tiny slight becomes a Twitter war in 10 seconds, you know, it's going to impact the national character going forward for a whole generation. And I think the example he set for young people about how to comport yourself, I think was a really important one, even if I didn't agree with a lot of the things that he did policy-wise. So, you know, looking back, I really admire Barack Obama. I think he acquitted himself incredibly well in a nearly impossible situation, despite the fact that I was disappointed in some of his decisions.
Next call for Matt Taibbi comes from Diana in Lone Pine, California. Hi, Diana.
Hi, I'm so happy that I get to speak to you, Matt.
Hi.
My first part is a comment, and I just want to say thank you for saying that about Roger Ailes. Like, I've been watching all this stuff back and forth on various news channels for years, and always the level of viciousness that came from Fox and the level of fear. I watched it affect my friends, and I'm older, and it was like they just became so locked in that we can't talk about anything like that, because I'm more of a liberal type gal, and I just want to thank you for helping me with my thinking, that I wasn't going loony, that one person can affect a whole nation like that, like day after day, year after year, just spouting such, his reporters just spouting such mean stuff, and most of the time inaccurate. But anyways, the question I wanted to ask you was, why do we need health insurance companies? Like, I've had rounds with cancer, and luckily I've had Medicare, and I live because of that. But I remember being, as a child, we just went to the doctor. There wasn't any big issue about insurance. And so why do we need insurance companies that take trillions of dollars? Anyways, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's been a while since I've covered that subject, but I remember that looking at the comparison of the costs between, because America's health coverage is by far, we have the most expensive healthcare in the world compared to other industrialized nations, and the vast majority of the money that we spend that other countries don't spend, it goes to a couple of areas: paperwork and profit. Those are the biggest areas of waste in the American healthcare system, and so you could solve the paperwork problem by having something like a single-payer healthcare system where we at least had some uniformity in billing, paperwork, and collections. Right now, I remember visiting a hospital in Bayonne, New Jersey, and which I think subsequently shut down, where half of their administrative staff was chasing collections. And because they were dealing with so many different health insurance companies, and they had to do so much work just to get to the point where they were trying to collect from the different health insurers, that it sapped all of their bottom line, and they eventually went out of business, I believe. And that system just makes no sense to me. And of course, profit in this area. I understand that companies have to make money for providing a service, but when half of the money that we spend on healthcare is profit, that doesn't make sense to me either. So, it's not an area of expertise for me, but clearly the American system is the most irrational and illogical one in the world. And I agree with you. I remember one of the things I enjoyed about Russia is that when I got sick, I could just walk into a doctor's office, and the doctors there didn't have the best equipment. They didn't have the best medicines always. Their shelves were sometimes empty, but they would see me, and I think that's something that this generation is growing up without, this idea that healthcare is something that you have a right to, and I think that's too bad. So yeah, in terms of Roger Ailes, incidentally, I agree with you. I've had a lot of people say the same things to me, that they lost family members over the years because their fathers or mothers or their aunts or uncles watched the television all day long and became increasingly angry and bitter, and unable to talk to their friends and relatives anymore. And I think the way we consume media now, and I think Fox was the pioneer of this, has made it impossible for people with political differences to be friends, and that's really a shame. When I grew up, I can't remember it mattering what a person's political opinions were, and now it means everything, and that's just a weird thing. It's really strange, isn't it?
Did the Rolling Stones' Jan Wenner assign you the financial beat, or did you ask to cover that for many years?
So I believe what happened with Jan, and so after the presidential election in 2008, because I'd covered that, they assigned me, it was Jan and my editor at the time, Will Dana. We did one story, and they assigned one that was about AIG, if I remember correctly. And that was very difficult for me because I had to understand, I didn't know anything, so starting from zero, I had to learn what a collateralized debt obligation was, or CDSs and all these things, and so that took me a long time, but we did it, and we got such a huge response to it because financial media up till that point had exclusively been written by people who were catering to people in the finance sector. There is no financial reporting for ordinary people. And so this idea of translating for regular people how Wall Street works, it was a new thing. It had never been done before. And so we got such a response that we just kept doing it, and it turned into 8 years of work. So that was a really cool thing. But Jan, he was great during that entire time. I don't think that there are many editors who would allow reporters to do 8,000-word features about, subprime mortgage fraud or, how foreclosure works. These are really arcane, difficult, labyrinthine topics, and they don't sound sexy, and it's hard to sell advertising probably to those topics. But he let me, explore them for a long, long time, and it was great stuff. And I think that's all you can ask for in an editor, is that they support you in that way.
Matt Taibbi's most recent book is Insane Clown President. We have another hour and a half to go in our program today. And Chris in Montague, Michigan, you're on the air.
Hi, Matt. I've been reading your articles in Rolling Stone, and I've seen some similarities between your reporting and Hunter S. Thompson's and coverage of the Nixon campaign. And I was just wondering if he was an influence of yours, or who some of your other influences might be. Thanks, C-SPAN.
Thanks. It's Chris, right? Yeah.
Yes, Chris in Michigan.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, clearly Hunter Thompson was an influence of mine. I think every political reporter in the country grew up reading his books. Actually, one of the high points of my entire career was that I got to write the introduction to the latest edition of Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail. That was a huge honor for me. I remember when I was, I think, 15 years old, my father and another friend of mine, we took a road trip from New York to Key West, and all we did the whole way down was read Hunter Thompson aloud in the car. And I love the way he wrote. I thought he was this weird four-dimensional almost kind of writer, and it was so funny, and he had his own language. It wasn't like dated. He didn't write in 60s or 70s language. He kind of invented his own strange language, and I was really fascinated by him. He was an influence on me, and I try not to copy him, but it's really hard not to, especially since I have his job, and I'm covering the same stuff that he was covering, so it's hard not to fall into those patterns. But in terms of other reporters, I grew up reading H.L. Mencken also. He was somebody who I loved reading. Terry Southern, and then there were a lot of Russians who I read over the years who I thought were great writers. Sergei Dovlatov, who was kind of like a reporter. He wrote fiction, but also it was sort of journalism. But yeah, in terms of that, there are other writers who I read who weren't journalists, but of the journalists, I think those are the big ones.
Did you ever meet Hunter S. Thompson?
I talked to him on the phone once.
What was that like?
So I got assigned. A publishing company asked me to do a compilation, it was supposed to be a book about gonzo journalism. So I was supposed to put together a compilation of gonzo reporting. And I was young at the time, and I kind of needed the money, and I started doing it, and I chose a whole bunch of articles that I thought kind of fit the tradition a little bit. But then I started to come up against this problem that really, when you thought about it, all gonzo journalism meant was like Hunter Thompson, And I thought, I can't really do this project without his assent. And I also would, I needed to know what he thought about it. So I called him up, and he said, "Oh, it sounds like a crappy project." And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "How badly do you need the money?" And I said, "Pretty badly." And he goes, "Well, I can't be part of it, but good luck to you, And he basically guilted me out of doing it, so I didn't do it. But he was cool, And I obviously since have met lots of people who knew him very well, but he was nice to me. He took my call at least.
Alexander sends in this email. I found Insane Clown President at the library next to Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, which I was going to pick up. Reading them together was quite interesting. Was curious if you've ever read Amusing Ourselves to Death.
I have not.
And if it was influential to you. Okay. Well, the second part of that question is, what are you currently reading, Matt? And any recommendations for the summer? Well, one of the things we do here on our in-depth program is we ask our guests for what they are reading, some of the books that have influenced them, and some of their other influences. And here are the responses that Matt Taibbi gave us. Matt Taibbi, you list a couple of books by Evelyn Waugh as some of your favorites, Scoop and Decline and Fall. Who was he and why is he on your list?
He was a very funny British writer, a satirist. I think his books, they have almost like a Candide-like quality to them. They're really, they rush from scene to scene. They're like a lot of British writers, they're of that genre. He has incredibly witty dialogue. You know, it's sort of in the Oscar Wilde, Noel Coward kind of vein. But or Graham Greene was another one of my favorite writers. But what I love about Evelyn Waugh is that his books are just so beautifully structured. They're so incredibly economical. Every line is tight. There's no wasted motion in any of it, and it's just, they're hilarious from start to finish. They make you think. Scoop, which is a book that every foreign correspondent carries on his or her person, all over the world. It's a great story about a guy who has a gardening column in a British newspaper, and he, by accident, gets dispatched to cover a civil war in Abyssinia in the middle of Africa, and because it's like all comedies, it's a misunderstanding. Basically, an influential person asks for somebody by that name, and the editor mistakenly thinks it's this gardening columnist, and so they send him out to this brutal place, and it's just hilariously funny. And Waugh he's like a great model for just satire in general, because he has this kind of panoramic view of the entire absurdity of the human experience, and on top of that, just in terms of his craftsmanship, he was just an incredibly polished, seamless kind of writer. So he kind of checks all the boxes for me.
Have you read Anna Karenina
in Russian?
In Russian.
Yes. Yeah, that was one of the first books I actually read in Russian. And I know how that sounds because it's such a big book, but Tolstoy, one of the great things about Tolstoy, I can't believe I just said that, that sounds so pretentious, but Tolstoy's writing, even in English, even in translation, it comes through that he has this incredible rare gift for the powerful, simple sentence, right? Like he finds the absolute simplest way to communicate the most complicated thoughts, and that his prose has this kind of like pulsating force, that kind of picks up speed over time, and you even in Russian, my Russian is good but not fantastic. Let's put it that way. But he uses simple words and simple structure in a way that is just, I think, gorgeous. And it's interesting because I also like some Russian writers who have the opposite quality, like Gogol and Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky was a big fan of Gogol's. Gogol was a fan of these huge sprawling sentences and paragraphs that are just crammed through with subordinate clauses, and it's like really difficult to follow and Baroque. But I like that style too. It's just there are two different ways of achieving the same thing. But Tolstoy is just the simplicity is amazing and beautiful and ingenious.
And now you're a fan of footnotes, using footnotes in your work.
Footnotes, yeah. And again, I grew up, I was way more a fan of the kind of Gogol method growing up, which is to have huge, long run-on sentences and complications and subordinate clauses and parentheses, and I thought it was a cool thing to kind of force the reader to do a little bit of work, on the way to getting to the point or to the punchline or whatever it was, and footnotes and taking various journeys on the way to finishing. That was I used to do that much more. Now I'm trying to go the other way and make more simple declarative sentences and use fewer adverbs and subordinate clauses and stuff like that.
On your current reading list, Can't We Disagree More Constructively by Jonathan Haidt. What is that book about? Who is Jonathan Haidt?
He's I believe, a professor here in New York City. And this is just because I've been really depressed by the state of American politics lately. And I just think the partisan nature of it has become so angry and so unredeeming, and it's the opposite of uplifting. Like when I read a political book, I usually want to feel better about life, or at least clearer, And now most of the time when I'm reading political writing, it's just a bunch of people denouncing another bunch of people. And I've become interested in the idea of, is there another way? Is there anything that's happier out there? And it's that was why I read, before this book, I read a book called Utopia for Realists by a Dutch writer named Rutger Bregman, I think is his name. And it's just all about, another approach to politics that's vastly different, and why can't we have big ideas anymore? And so, I'm reading Jonathan. It doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with him. I'm just looking around for somebody who's got a different approach to politics, and that isn't just blue versus red. I'm just so tired of that narrative.
Matt Taibbi is our guest on Book TV. Here is how you can contact us this afternoon. 202 is the area code. 748-8200 if you live in the East and Central time zone. 748-8201 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Now, throughout the show, we'll also put up our social media addresses if you can't get through on the phone line and still want to get a comment or a question in. Matt Taibbi is the author of 7 books. His first one came out in 2000, and this is called The Exile: Sex, Drugs, and Libel in the New Russia. Spanking the Donkey came out in 2005, Dispatches from the Dumb Season. Smells Like Dead Elephants, Dispatches from a Rotting Empire in 2007. Spanking the Donkey came out in 2005. The Great Derangement, a terrifying true story of war, politics, and religion, 2009. Griftopia, story of bankers, politicians, and the most audacious power grab in American history, came out in 2011. And The Divide, American Injustice in the Age of the Wealth Gap, 2014. And Insane Clown President, Dispatches from the 2016 Circus, just came out this year. And I want to ask you about something you wrote in The Great Derangement. And of course, I've lost that piece of paper right now, so we'll have to, I see it right down here. But if you could explain what this is about.
Uh-oh.
I have a confession to make. It's not something that's easy to explain, but here goes. After 2 days of nearly constant religious instruction, songs, worship, and praise, 2 days that for me meant an unending regime of forced and fake responses, a funny thing started to happen to my head.
So this was, I was undercover, right? I was trying to do, I guess it was a little bit of a spin on, like, you know, the kind of, like a Black Like Me kind of a thing. I instead of, I sort of immersed myself in this apocalyptic church down in Texas, and it was one of those mega churches where they believe the end of the world is coming. And you know, they're rapturists, basically, was what they're called. The pastor is sort of a famous guy named John Haidt. He's a big supporter of John McCain. And I was just interested in what that mindset was like. And so in order to do that, I had to craft this persona and join the church, and I came up with this alternative identity. And I went away on retreats and learned all the prayers and did all this stuff. And I think that's the section of the book where I'm talking about how I started to like it after a while. And, you know, that was kind of a key insight for me, which was that there's a soothing quality to all of these rituals. And, you know, the first time I walked into the church and listened to the music, I thought, this is the worst music I've ever heard in my life. But then after about 5 weeks of this, I started to sing along with it. I was getting into it, and by the time I left, it was getting to the point where I thought I have to get out of here before, you know, something happens to me permanently. So, you know, it was an interesting moment. I was trying to explain how people can fall for something that on the outside seems ridiculous. But you know, they took people who were vulnerable, who were going through difficult things in their lives, and they gave them answers, and some of them were simplistic, but it provided comfort, and I was just trying to understand that.
Let's hear from Marie in La Mesa, California. Hi, Marie.
Hi, thank you so much for having Book TV. I've been a longtime follower and also a longtime follower of Matt Taibbi. Regarding that, the last thing that he addressed about enjoying the church that he was going to, social psychologists speak to that, and of course marketers know very well how the brain works. I'm 80 years old. I'm a volunteer with the KNSJ in San Diego Community Radio, independent, non-commercial station. And I was wondering if Matt has suggestion about community radio across the United States. We provide an alternative voice in San Diego to what we're hearing on the news constantly here. And Matt, you said that we should be seen as the truth in reporting news, and I'm wondering I'm wondering how, as you go on your speaking tours and you're talking about the Trump administration, Trump himself, when we see a personal view of someone who reports news, then for those who read what that news person writes, can we see the truth?
I mean, that's a good question. The question of how do you get at the truth? What like for instance, it's Marie, right? I think Marie. So for community radio, just to answer that part of the question first, I've never worked on radio before, but I do think that that local media is making a little bit of a comeback, and some of it is through internet-based media like podcasts, which have taken ideas like Serial and they've done it for their own. I mean, I think that's one thing that's great that community radio can do easily and with relatively low cost, is do things like 12-part series about local issues, right? So you can do some local scandal or a crime or a trial, and it'll be interesting to your listeners because it's in their neighborhood and it's about people they know, but you can use storytelling techniques. You can make characters out of people. I think that's one of the cool things about the kind of flowering of new media. As much as I've been critical of the fracturing of it, we have all these new innovations in form now that we've found all these different new interesting ways to tell stories and to do the news. So if I were in community radio now, I'd be really excited about all the different things that I could do. You could essentially make a kind of rolling reality show about a local trial or I don't know, even a local little league team or anything, these are things that we wouldn't have thought to do 40 or 50 years ago when news was always, on the radio was 4-minute broadcasts of this or that, or at the talk show. Now you can do, sophisticated storytelling. You can do undercover things. There's all kinds of cool stuff you can do at radio. So, I would just try to be as creative as possible with that, and take advantage of the fact that you're local, and that's a way to compete with national media. You know the characters better than NBC, CBS, and CNN know them. So that's an advantage that you have. In terms of trying to be truthful and can we ever really know the truth? I mean, that's a huge metaphysical question, but what I would say is, the best way to kind of arrive at an understanding of what's going on in the world for me is just to consume as many different sources as possible and try to get at what the common themes are. Like for instance, when I was trying to learn about Wall Street, and I didn't know anything going into it, what I would do is I would call 20 or 30 people and ask them the same question. What is a collateralized debt obligation? How does it work? Or, what's a synthetic CDO? Or what happened with the Lehman bankruptcy? And, I would get 30 stories and 25 of them would be similar. And, then you start to take the common threads, and it's always an amalgamating process when you're trying to figure out what's actually going on. You're never going to get the whole unvarnished truth from anybody, but that's what we do as human beings. We got to put it all together, but that's what being informed is all about. Just read as much as possible.
Have you gotten into podcasts? I mean, either listening or creating?
I listen to them, and I may be starting a podcast soon. So it's not quite ready to go, but yeah, I'm thinking about doing that. So I think it's a cool thing. It's a neat way of kind of communicating with your audience, and it also allows you to do some different stuff. I mean, the work that I do. It's pretty tough to do, comedy or anything or movie reviews or book reviews. It allows you to kind of go in different directions. and I think it's neat. I think there's a lot of really interesting work going on with that.
Next call, Eric is in Middletown, New York. Eric, you're on Book TV with Matt Taibbi. Hi.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Nice to talk to you both. Matt,
Hi.
I've got a bit of a complex one here for you, and I can touch on just about every single thing that's been part of the discussion this morning. First off, your dad was my news guy, along with Connie and Sue Simmons for about the first 25 years of my life. But
there you go.
I'm wondering
Excellent.
Yeah, it's I grew up on that stuff, and I spent many years in Manhattan and Brooklyn as a funeral director. I think I spotted you a couple of times around the NYU campus back around 05, 6, 7, 8. So in any event, I'm wondering. Yeah, I mean, you got a look to you, and you're definitely your father's son. You guys, a couple of handsome fellas. So in any event. I'm wondering, it's funny, this last caller from public or nonprofit, non-commercial radio, what a gal, huh? 80 years old, still kicking tail. Mm-hmm. But in any event, you mentioned you guys were discussing the utility of a thing like a trial, and that's something I'm dealing with. And it involves a corporate crime, something you touched on with the California welfare case. Well, they'll go after individual benefit recipients, but not these larger companies that are just reaping these massive quantities of money. I'm wondering, are you familiar with a case in New York that's basically now in its 10th year? It's been through the entire appellate structure, has created new law, and it's entitled Landon v. Kroll. It involves criminal justice system drug testing. Are you familiar with it at all?
All right, Eric, thank you very much. Matt Taibbi?
No, I'm not familiar with it, but I'm interested in it. Can we go on? I'm curious. What's it about?
He is not with us anymore,
okay.
So you're going to have to do your own research on that case. I apologize. But you do talk, and I want to say it's from Griftopia, you talk about the fact that it's much easier to get a slam dunk conviction, but not to take a complex case to court that could last 10, 20 years.
Yeah, no, I heard this over and over again from prosecutors. They said, look at it from our point of view, right? Like, we get evaluated according to how many convictions we get. So if you're us, are you going to go take HSBC to court, and they have the best lawyers in the world, and the standard of proof is it's not easy to meet, or are we going to take 50 drug dealers to court and get wins on all of them? And some of them, we just throw them in the box and we scare them and they confess, whereas with these gigantic financial institutions, they don't admit a thing. They dig in. They've got the best lawyers in the world. And even when they're plainly guilty, it is extremely difficult to get convictions. I mean, I covered a trial, or it takes so long that they sometimes can wait out the criminal justice system and force them into mistakes because they are trying to get within the statute of limitations. I covered a case that involved bid rigging in the municipal bond market, and they had these guys on tape, and they clearly had them, but it took so long to get that case through court, among other things because they had to educate the jury about all the jargon. And they had to defeat so many motions just to get there, that by the time they went to trial, they ended up losing some of the defendants because they didn't meet the 10-year statute of limitations. So if you're a prosecutor, it is a difficult choice. You're going to take on these banks and you're going to lose a lot of the time. But the problem is, I still think symbolically you got to try, because otherwise what you're saying to the people is, we're giving up. Right, we're just going to take the money from these guys because it's too hard to take them to trial. So we'll take the check, and then we're going to put these people in jail, which invalidates jail as far as I'm concerned. That makes it if a certain class of people can't go to jail and only a certain class of people can, then that's not legitimate criminal justice to me. So I think you got to try anyway.
Next call is Rob in Milford, Connecticut. Rob, please go ahead.
Matt, as the only conservative who's called in today, I'm quite sure. Peter, I hope I can get my comment and question out, because as we conservatives see nationwide, the left is very intolerant of disagreeable voices. You talked earlier about not liking the words liberal and conservative. They're shorthand. But you went to Bard College, which is an extremely liberal college. You work for a man, Jan Wenner, who's an extremely liberal man. You've quoted H.L. Mencken and Hunter Thompson. We saw Hunter's picture on the screen. You've denigrated Roger Ailes' Fox News. You've used the word conservative twice. You haven't used the word liberal. I understand what you said, and I agree. There's no such thing as objectivity. But my comment is I think that you are as partisan as Fox News, just on the other side. My question is to do with race. Over the past 50 years, by every single metric, all negative human behavior is disproportionately occupied by black and Latino people. I contend that black and Latino men, roughly between the ages of 15 and 40, 15 and 45, have been and are today our greatest domestic liability. $8 trillion have been spent since 1965, the war on poverty. Matt, please answer this question. I can't get one liberal anywhere here at Yale to answer this. Is there any country in sub-Saharan Africa or where Spanish is spoken whose standard of living is comparable or greater than ours?
Matt Taibbi, that was Rob in Milford, Connecticut.
I don't even know where to begin with that question. I mean, it's preposterous. What you're really saying is that you think that inherently, racially, black and Hispanic people are more prone to negative behavior than white people. I mean, that's what you're saying with that question. It's absurd. It's preposterous, and I think you should be ashamed of yourself. Yeah, if you want to come after me and say I'm a liberal and I'm an upper middle class white kid who went to Bard College and I work for Jan Wenner and you don't see any difference between me and Fox News, that's fine. Even though I clearly regularly go after the Democratic Party in my work, and I've never heard once Fox News take on a conservative on that station. I try to look at everybody, and I disagree with people. Of my own political character all the time, because I think that's healthy. It's not a business for me. I don't do this to try to scare liberals into tuning into my articles so that I can make money. This is about trying to call things as I see them, and that's not what Fox News does. And I think that your views, I couldn't disagree with them more strongly, and I feel sorry for you that you feel that way.
This is Carolyn in Spearfish, South Dakota. Matt, how much blame should this is an email, how much blame should belong to the New York Times and Washington Post for so excoriating Trump that the voters went the other way in response?
I don't know about singling out those two publications, but I do think that was a phenomenon that was true. When I talked about this in my book, that when the reporters went after Trump, he rose in the polls. He didn't go down. Every single time he had one of those scandals, like for instance after, when he said, "I like people who weren't captured," about John McCain, the conventional wisdom among the press corps was that's an unsurvivable scandal, right? You can maybe say bad things about Mexicans in America, but about veterans, come on. I mean, no politician has ever survived something like that. And not only did he not go down in the polls when he was excoriated in the media, he rose, and then when he was confronted about it, he denied that he ever said it, and the media went after him more, and he went up higher in the polls. And I think what we learned in that experience, or we should have learned, is that the huge section of the public dislikes us more than they dislike Donald Trump, and they distrust us more than they distrust somebody like Donald Trump. And this is why I have a little bit of trouble with people who say things like the media didn't call out Trump enough, because we certainly did. It was just that we don't have any influence over a segment of the population anymore. And that's, I think we have to examine why that is. Why are we not listened to by people out there? And I think some of it's a class thing. Some of it's just that we are not interested in the same things that Trump voters are interested in. But whatever it is, we have to address it, because that was a problem.
From the 2009 book, The Great Derangement, Matt Taibbi writes, Washington politicians basically view the people as a capricious and dangerous enemy, a dumb mob whose only interesting quality happens to be in their power to take away politicians' jobs.
Right, yeah. I mean, this is something I hear over and over again from people who work in Congress, and I've heard lots of stories from people who talk about how the worst job in a Senate office or a House office is the person who has to answer the constituent telephone calls. You know, I hear stories about people who sit there and when the phone rings, they just hold it like this. Politicians look at the voter as a kind of haranguing nuisance who, I'm talking generally. There are obviously exceptions that I've run into, but for the most part, politics can be conducted without a whole lot of interaction with the voter. Basically, you construct a policy that your donors support. You get money from your donors in exchange for creating legislation that they like. Then you do commercials. You put the commercials on air. You do appearances in the legacy media, and you run elections that way. And most of them are not seriously opposed anyway. So. If you play your cards right, you basically don't have to leave Washington in order to get reelected. I mean, you have to go home symbolically to make a few appearances, but the way the game is played now, it's all about raising money and doing commercials and doing legacy media appearances, and you can do all of that without really talking to people, and I think that's a big problem with our politics. And interestingly, sorry to interrupt, Trump differed from that. Trump based his entire strategy on talking to people, on the physically interacting with people in all these small towns, and it was hugely successful.
This is Joe, and this is an email. New York City. Trump wants to repeal McCarran-Ferguson Act of 1944, allow insurance companies to cross state lines. You wrote that in Griftopia.
I did, yeah. I was really interested to hear. I remember hearing him talk about that for the first time in New Hampshire. He said it in a very strange way. He kind of talked about insurance companies and how and the lines. It didn't quite make sense at first, but then I realized he was talking about the antitrust exemption. But I haven't seen any evidence that he wants to repeal the antitrust exemption enjoyed by health insurance companies. So it could turn out to be one of these things that, Trump talked about a lot of things that he wanted to do on the campaign trail, but we're not seeing any evidence that he's actually going to do them. Like, he wanted to end the carried interest tax break, for people who are in private equity. Well, where's that proposal now? We'll see. It was interesting hearing him talk about it. And it was one of many kind of populist themes that he sounded as a candidate that seemed to work with people. But again, as president, is he going to carry through on any of it? We'll see. I don't know. I wrote about this the other day. I mean, a similar example was, he was in favor of importing drugs from Canada, but we haven't seen any evidence that he's really pushing for that either. So,
same with Barack Obama.
Same with Barack Obama, exactly. So this is again, it's a problem with American politics, which is that campaigns don't have a whole lot of connection to reality. They're just shows, and people tend to be much more progressive or populist in their as candidates than they are once they get elected.
What would be the upside or the downside, in your view, Mr. Taibbi, of changing McCarran-Ferguson?
Well, it would increase competition between insurance companies. Right now, they don't have to compete with each other, and because of the antitrust exemptions they enjoy, they basically have little fiefdoms.
In each state.
In each state, yeah, exactly. And it was something that they got early on. I guess it was in the early 50s that they got this exemption, and they've had it ever since. And it's one of the main reasons why health insurance prices are so high, and the cost of healthcare is so high. And I think, I also favor, other approaches to the healthcare problem that would be more, less market-based maybe. But if we're going to go a market-based solution, then we have to at least, make it more like a free market. Right now it's essentially a big protectionist racket where, the country's divvied up into little territories and they get to charge whatever they want within those territories. So.
From Insane Clown President, Matt Taibbi's most recent book, voters in America not only aren't over-empowered, they for decades now have been almost totally disenfranchised, subjects of one of the more brilliant change-suppressing systems ever invented. I'm going to read that one more time because I stumbled way too much. Voters in America not only aren't over-empowered, they've for decades now been almost totally disenfranchised, subjects of one of the more brilliant change-suppressing systems ever invented.
Yeah, and I think, well, all I was saying is that it's all the things that we talked about here today. Voters, they've only had two choices for the most part, and both of those choices have tended to be supported by the same gigantic corporate donors. So there's a weeding out process that has been happening before people even get to the point where they actually get to make a political choice. We essentially eliminate everybody who doesn't have the assent of the national news media, of the political donor class, and of the two major political parties. That has been a triumvirate that has kind of closely guarded the gates of power for decades in this country. Yes, we get to choose between one of two parties that are acceptable to those groups, but that's not a terribly wide amount of political choice. Interestingly, Trump kind of broke that mold. He was a true outsider in a way. He didn't need the money of the donor class to get elected, and he didn't use the media to get elected in the traditional way. And he was an outsider to the Republican Party, and so he didn't use their political machinery. So there is a blueprint now for somebody else to get elected. Unfortunately, when we finally had a real political choice, we, I think, spent it on the wrong person, but it was interesting.
Next call for Matt Taibbi comes from Linda in Phoenix. Linda, please go ahead. We're listening.
Yes, great program, as always, and I loved your talking about the great Russian writers that we read in New York in the public schools, in high school, in the public schools. But my question or comment is, during the course of this whole program, the essence has been a very bleak picture here in the United States. The polarization, I go back, my generation is the Vietnam War generation. And even then in the 60s, we weren't as polarized economically, politically, culturally as we are today. It is so disturbing for people, for persons of my generation right now. We can't see this continuing on as it is. How can we continue on as a sovereign nation with a government that is inoperable, that is growingly inoperable? And all I can see is, given history, the divisions, the strong divisions, and an electorate where 1 in 6 persons believes that democracy is not important to them, how can this not eventually erupt in civil unrest to perhaps the casus belli?
Thank you, Linda. Let's leave it there. Let's hear from Matt Taibbi.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I totally agree with you. I'm distressed about all the same things. I think we're in an age of polarization that is, when we're going in a direction that's unsustainable. I remember way back when I was writing The Great Derangement, or actually even before that, I did a story where I was like undercover working in the Bush campaign in 2004. I remember listening to people, and this was back then just about Republicans, but the thing that was really interesting to me is that they didn't have a vision of the country that included the, sort of liberals. All they really wanted, their idea, the sort of, fantasy conception of the perfect America was a world where just these liberal professors and actors from Hollywood and media figures, they just didn't exist anymore. They didn't want to get along with them. They just wanted them kind of out of the way. And I thought, well, wow, that's such a negativistic vision of the country. Like, we have to have a vision where everybody kind of finds a way to get along, and they don't have that. Now I see the same thing going on with the other side. I see, there's a new kind of politics that I think has come up in the last year or so, where it's not, if you're a Democrat, sometimes it's not about, here's what we stand for positively. The biggest thing that they're about is being against Republicans, and they don't have a vision of the country that includes, Republicans. And look, I understand there are frustrations. People are angry. They believe that the Republicans made a racist choice. They're misogynist, but we have to live together, ultimately, all of us. And so there has to be, somebody has to come up with a way that allows us all to talk to each other again. And I don't know what that is, but I think that's the magic formula going forward, is we have to have some kind of national reconciliation. And I hope it's sooner rather than later.
From Insane Clown President, Matt Taibbi writes that politics used to be a simple, predictable con. Every 4 years, the money men in D.C. would team up with party hacks to throw their weight behind whatever half-bright fraud of a candidate proved most adept at snowing the population into buying a warmed-over version of the same crappy policies they've always bought. Did 2016 change all that?
Yeah, definitely. I think it did.
And for the future, too?
Possibly. I mean, what happened with Trump and, to a lesser extent, Sanders upset the apple cart, maybe forever, because the formula has changed now. Again, in the old days, in order to win, in order to actually get to the White House, as opposed to just being interesting and a factor like Ross Perot, in order to actually win, you needed that institutional support of the party, the money, and the press. Now, what Trump and Sanders both showed is that the voting public has a way of thinking for itself now that doesn't include this sort of institutional, bureaucratic structure. And so it's not as simple a matter of as a bunch of people with money getting together with the party elders and deciding who's going to be the salesman, who's going to sell the policies to the people. Now it's a bit of an open season. Anybody can run, anybody can win, and in the case of Trump, that turned out to be a negative, but it's interesting at least. It's opened up the range of possibilities.
How long did it take you to write a paragraph like that we just read?
Oh, I don't know. I write fairly quickly, I guess, but I obsess. I think that writers do it different ways. I read Philip Roth once that something about the way he writes, that he writes like 500 words a day or something like this. And I may be missing who this was about, but the whole point was to, that they would get the sentence correct ahead of time and then commit it to paper and, handwritten. I put text down pretty quickly, but then I sort of obsessively go back and play with it until it's smaller and tighter, and so it's everybody does it a different way.
Campaigns needed people only as props, Matt Taibbi writes. If a candidate wanted to show that he or she was with it on racial issues, that candidate would visit a predominantly black high school and be photographed clapping to a school band performance. If he wanted a worker-friendly image, he'd visit a robotics factory in Wisconsin and be photographed wearing a hard hat and goggles, and so on.
Right. Yeah, and again, this is just the same thing that what I was talking about before. You don't really need people to be a politician anymore. You need them to be props for photo ops, but to actually talk to them, have their support, they had mastered a way of running elections that did not necessarily involve the active participation of voters. And they were able to do it through, money, stagecraft, production values. All of that stuff allowed them to bypass, the old school version of politics where you had to actually go into the union halls and or, Elks Club or whatever it was and convince people. Now it's not done that way anymore. I think, and Trump, incidentally, has pioneered an even more interesting way of running politics, which is he didn't even have a campaign. He just was literally a human being with a couple of overheated ganglia behind his eyes appearing on television, and he just let the entire media system be his campaign structure. And he didn't even need staff, let alone people, to run his campaign. So that was interesting too. And
sometimes his speeches would just be all riffs, wouldn't they?
They were almost all entirely riffs. I talked to my first boss in journalism was the late Wayne Barrett, who was an investigative reporter here at the Village Voice. He died earlier this year, but he was one of Trump's first biographers. And I talked to Wayne about Trump, and one of the things he told me was that Donald Trump had never in his life read a prepared text until his father died, and he read something at his funeral. And so I watched out for that, and what you would see on the campaign trail with Trump was you would go to a place and sometimes his campaign would distribute a flyer that would have the prepared remarks on it. And the first line would say something like, well, so great to be back in Manchester. And he would say, it's so great to be back in Manchester. And then the second line on, it was all like ad-libbed. He's like constitutionally incapable of sticking to a script. Although he did do it for a brief period after Steve Bannon got hired, which I thought was interesting. And that period kind of changed his campaign when he did this bizarre thing about reaching out to the African American voter, and he actually read those speeches. You could see he was almost like a prisoner of war reading. But for the most part, he just gets up there and riffs, and I think even he doesn't know what he's going to say most of the time.
Next call for Matt Taibbi comes from Elizabeth in San Marcos, California. Elizabeth, please go ahead. We're listening.
Hi, I love your work, Matt, but I called in to mention that Obama never really gets credit for landing the plane after the economy was headed off the cliff. And, then the plane landed on the oceans and everybody got into the lifeboats and the Republicans refused to row, So with that as a backdrop, I think it really affected Obama's ability in his early days to get a lot of things accomplished, like single payer, given that our healthcare system is like 1/5 of the economy at that time. All these jobs, to eliminate those at that point would have been catastrophic. But anyway, I want to jump in on your media thing and ask you a question. I don't think that Trump, number one, we have now a shattered media environment. Trump sends out tweets and everybody's chasing around like a laser pointer, and big issues are not getting addressed. Everyone's running off to talk about some insane, Kofifi or whatever. And the underlying issues that democracy really demands a lot of. It's boring, it's, try to get 100 people in a room to agree on anything. And that's kind of what our system is built on. And, but would you agree that in our media environment today, Trump really didn't do it alone? I mean, drive time radio is all conservative other than NPR. And Fox News is there showing an alternate universe from what you're seeing on CNN. And so the idea that CNN and MSNBC created Trump, I don't necessarily buy that. Given the number of men that are driving around, that have jobs as drivers in this country today, that's who's driving around in the middle of the country. They're listening to Rush Limbaugh and Laura Ingraham and there's so many conservative talkers and there are very, very few liberal talkers. So anyway, could you comment on that a little bit? Thank you.
That's Elizabeth in San Marcos.
Yeah, Elizabeth. Thanks. Just to quickly talk about the first thing, because that's a little bit sort of near and dear to my heart, the whole issue of Barack Obama and his response to the financial crisis. I remember talking to people on Wall Street before Obama took office, during the transition in 2008, when the economy was in full meltdown mode, and clearly they were still in the process of constructing the bailouts, and the bailouts were incidentally almost a completely bipartisan effort. What Obama and Tim Geithner did were essentially the same things that George W. Bush and Hank Paulson started while the economy began to tank in September. But beyond that, I remember talking to lots of people on Wall Street, and not everybody had this view, but some people had this view that they were looking forward to Barack Obama coming into office because he was somebody who had incredible communication skills and would be able to get up in front of the country and explain what had happened with the subprime mortgage crisis, which was this incredibly involved, complicated fraud that had essentially been perpetrated on the markets, and had disproportionately targeted sort of people of color and lower income individuals, and had led to this massive foreclosure crisis. And Obama really didn't do that. He elected to sort of not address the root causes of the crisis in his response to it. And he continued a policy that the Republicans started, which was to essentially throw a huge sum of money at the financial services sector to allow them to get well again. And they did, and it worked to a degree, but there were sort of persistent structural problems that were left in place that laid the groundwork for, I think, future problems in the markets. So I understand that he inherited an unprecedented problem, but at least in the area of the stuff that I covered, I think he was disappointing, at least on that level, because he was somebody who could have sorted out, which was something that was a very difficult topic for the public, and he really just declined to do it. When he did get a chance to talk about it on 60 Minutes, one of the few things that he said was some of the least ethical behavior on Wall Street wasn't illegal, which is really lawyering. I mean, it's true. That doesn't mean that other bad behavior on Wall Street wasn't illegal. It just means that some of it wasn't illegal. And I think he was trying to split the baby in a way with that issue, and that was disappointing to me. On the other issue about Trump not doing it alone, well, the only thing I would say to that is those afternoon radio and Fox and the Daily Caller and all those things, they've always been there, and Barack Obama overcame them, and he won an election by 10 million votes in 2008. I don't think that the media landscape is not an insuperable obstacle to a skilled politician. I think what happened with the Trump phenomenon was there was a perfect storm of a disaffected public, a candidate who was uniquely suited to take advantage of the kind of reality show format of the campaign coverage. And then there was a Democratic, candidate that was kind of in disarray and fed into a lot of the rhetoric that Trump was laying out there. So yeah, I mean, he had all that media at his back, but so have other politicians, and they failed.
Back to insane clown president. Trump supporters are people who are tired of being told that they have to be part of some kind of coalition in order to have a political voice. They particularly hate being lectured about alienating minorities, especially by members of their own party.
Yeah, and this was something, oddly enough, that David Frum talked about in an article for The Atlantic. After Mitt Romney lost in 2012, the Republicans kind of looked at the results and said, geez, if we just did a little bit better with Hispanics, we'd probably have won that election. And so they started casting about for a candidate who would have like a softer message on immigration. And that was why Jeb Bush ended up with $100 million in his, his campaign effort early on in that race. But it turned out that the Republican electorate was in a completely different place. That's not where they wanted to go. They didn't want to be a more inclusive party. They didn't want to be more open-minded. They didn't want to welcome more people into the tent. They wanted what Donald Trump was selling, which was something, very different. In fact, he wanted to close the borders and send everybody back. And so I think the party was out of touch with its own electorate. And, they were probably right in terms of where the party should have gone, but it's a different matter to convince people to go there.
This is Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Matt Taibbi is our in-depth author guest this month, and Matt is calling in from Great Barrington, Massachusetts.
Hi, Mike. How you doing? Hello?
Hi, how are you doing?
Yeah, it's Matt Taibbi. Yeah. If I said Mike, I apologize. That's his father.
No problem.
But go ahead, Matt.
No problem.
Got a couple Matts.
I really appreciate the way you can slog through really complicated stuff like financial world and come out and explain it and make it clear. There's another area that's very complicated that no one touches on about why we have an insane clown president, why there are so many insane things, is biology. There was a Dr. Hammer in the early 80s that proved that the cause of all disease and mental disease is caused by shocks to the system. This is all empirically proven. He's like Snowden living in Norway. They won't even let him out at all. And I was wondering, you seem like a person that could actually slog through Russian and financial shit and really get to the bottom of it. But no one brings up biology, that we're animals doing all this shit.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Matt in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and Matt Taibbi here in New York. Any response for that gentleman?
I don't know that doctor's work, so I don't think I could comment on it. I'm not against doing medical stories, but that sounds like a big one to try to tackle, so I don't know.
You don't need to comment if you don't want to. This is an email from Marcellus, from Marcellus. Two things. Why is Saki, H.H. Monroe, one of your favorite writers? And why did you leave Intercept Online website?
Well, I'll answer the second question first because it's the less pleasant one. So I was going to start up a publication called, or a website called Racket, which was going to be part of the First Look media empire. And, all I can say is that it didn't work out. I had disagreements with management, and unfortunately that project never got off the ground. It was too bad. We had a lot of really talented, cool people there, and we were trying to recreate, I don't know if you remember Spy Magazine, that we wanted to do something kind of like that, and it just didn't work out, unfortunately.
Was it a money issue?
No, it was complicated. It was sort of an interpersonal thing, I would say, a clash of philosophies, I just didn't, and I may not be the best boss in the world either. So I think that didn't work out. But it's too bad. But they were really good people for the most part. In terms of Saki is another. He's actually not very well known to American audiences. This writer named Hector Hugh Monroe. He's a little bit like Waugh. They're a little bit similar in style. But Saki had a much darker, blacker sense of humor. If I remember correctly, his mother was trampled to death by a cow. So he wrote a lot of short stories that were sort of famous for having a very vicious. There was often a terrible animal in the story, and people were getting torn apart by polecats and things like that. But he had a very nasty, dark view of the sort of upper crust British aristocrats in the sort of last phase of the British Empire. And he was a brilliant wordsmith. very screwed up person personally, but he wrote these gorgeous, incredibly funny stories that were really some of my favorites growing up. I actually named my second son, his middle name is Monroe after Saki. I strongly advise anybody who's never read Saki stories to go do them, because they're really short. You can read them, in half an hour, but they're just brilliant and so funny. And it's too bad that he's not better known in the States.
Have you had any interaction at this point with the Trump White House? Have you called the press office?
I have, yeah. I've talked to some people in the Trump White House. Not on the record, though. So, I think one of the things that happened when this Russia story started to break is I just, for my own curiosity, I tried to figure out a lot of things. So I've been calling a lot of people in Congress, in the Senate, in the White House too, trying to make sense of it, but I haven't gotten enough to be able to report on it. So unfortunately, I don't have anything that I can really contribute on.
Well, Eric Levinson tweets in, on Russia, there are two stories that Matt conflates. Did Russia interfere in the election? Did Trump collude with Russia?
No, that's actually what I don't conflate. I've said from the beginning that, and if you look back, you'll see this in the first stories that I wrote about this, that I wouldn't be surprised at all if Russia was responsible for the hack of the DNC. Later, when Donald Trump himself said, I think it was probably Russia, I wrote about that too. I mean, I don't actually conflate those things. I think the problem is that people do conflate them. My issue with this story is, okay, let's say that that's true, right? That doesn't necessarily follow that Trump and the Russians colluded to do this. If you think about it from a logical point of view, there's no upside for the Russians to even involve Trump in that caper if they wanted to. I mean, that's the problem that I have, is people think that when I'm saying I don't see proof of the collusion, that I'm saying that nothing happened. I'm not saying that. I'm saying if you want to call someone a traitor who's committed espionage against the United States, you need something a little bit more solid than I think so. It's just not. That's where I am with that.
James in Denham Springs, Louisiana. Dear Sir, whenever I read your Rolling Stone articles about politicians and their misconduct, I get so mad that I have to put down the magazine and get a drink or take a walk around the block. Do you get just as mad while you're writing about them and their shenanigans?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes. But the writing about it is kind of the way you exercise that a little bit. Again, part of the job is to get upset. So you try to find ways to make sure that you're responding correctly to something that's horrible. I think it. If you're not getting upset, that's when you know that something's going on, and you're probably been doing it for too long.
Phil, Portland, Oregon. A few minutes left with our guest, Matt Taibbi.
Well, thank you, C-SPAN, and hello, Matt. Just a quick comment before my question. Hi. A quick comment before my question, and that this political system is quite sustainable as long as profit from office, political office, continues. The 90% answer to this profit from the office term limits. Now, my question. You write about the Wall Street grabbing of pensions. Does that involve public and private? And can it be stopped? Can they be controlled? And does it put too much risk to our public and private pensions? I'll take my answer off the air. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Yeah, well, so I wrote a lot about that in the last 8 years on a couple of different levels. One is, there's the whole question of who's managing public pension funds, and that's a separate issue. There's a whole question of, are we paying exorbitant fees for hedge funds that don't perform terribly well? manage our money. I talked to somebody who managed a pension fund in Illinois and a public pension fund, and he said, look, I'm paying a few pennies to invest the workers' money in this gigantic index fund, and it outperforms these hedge funds that I'd have to pay tens of millions of dollars to manage. So why would I bother? Because over a long period of time, and all pension funds are essentially long-term investments, index funds are going to do just fine for the most part. So there's that issue, but the issue that's more pertinent to the stuff that I did was the fact that when these gigantic financial companies were selling properties like these toxic subprime mortgage instruments, they very often targeted these big institutional investors like pension funds, because what they would do is they would take some state employee who manages these funds who might make $75,000 or $100,000, and they'd take the person to Vegas or to the Super Bowl and hang out with them for a week, and then that person, next thing you know, is buying $20 million worth of some product. And what happened in the financial crisis is that we saw losses of 25, 30, 35% across the board in these pension funds, private and public, because they were buying huge masses of these essentially worthless subprime mortgage instruments. It was a snake oil game. It's the same thing as people calling up your grandparents and offering them overpriced magazine subscriptions. You have a vulnerable buyer, and you just sell them as much as you can of a worthless product. And that's what happened in the financial crisis. That was so disturbing and so predatory and sociopathic, but it wasn't terribly well explained to the public, and that's one of the things that I was trying to get at.
Matt Taibbi, if somebody wanted to pick up one of your books, which one would you recommend to them?
Right now, probably The Divide. I think that's the one that I'm happiest about.
Came out in 2014.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time reporting on that book, and I think it's the most elaborate of the books that I've written. But I have another one coming out later this year that I'm really excited about. That's about the Eric Garner case here in New York, so I'm really looking forward to seeing how that one comes out.
The Divide, income inequality, incarceration inequality.
Yeah.
Two of the main topics.
Yeah, basically, I had been covering white-collar crime for a long period of time when I started writing this book, and after a period of time, I kept running up against this issue of, man, these guys are doing these incredible scams, and they're ripping off enormous sums of money, and some of them are brilliant. They're amazing crimes in their complexity, but they're not doing any time. Even when they get caught, they never get punished for it. And so in order to try to bring out for readers how outrageous and ridiculous that was, I had to try to understand how easy it was for other people to go to jail, and that was something I didn't know a whole lot about. And so The Divide is really kind of this exploration where I go to these various places and I talk to people who have been imprisoned and how they got to jail and how easy it is for an ordinary person who just sort of on the streets to end up with a record. Whereas I follow these other cases that are incredibly elaborate and destructive, and in the end nobody ends up having to pay a single cent or do a day in jail. And it's a story that you can't tell unless it's a compare and contrast exercise, and so that's what this is. It's kind of this vast exercise in sort of showing the two different justice systems.
Lee is in Rockville, Maryland, and Lee, you're on Book TV. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Really great show today, Peter. I used to enjoy hearing you on Imus in the morning. Of course, that's not on anymore, Matt. But anyway, you really had some good banter with him. A lot of good banter with him. You and I are old enough to remember when the communist world was known as the Red Menace, and the godless commies, things like that, when the Cold War was going on, and with good reason. Now, of course, the country called Russia is run by a KGB thug by the name of Vladimir Putin. And he's cut out of the same cloth. They still murder people. They still do all these the terrible things all around the world. They support the genocidal regime in Syria. They're not the Red Menace anymore. They're not the evil empire that Reagan used to call them, but they're a bunch of gangsters and thugs. Yet, we have a president who is constantly singing the praises of the Russians. His national security advisor, initially, Flynn, was in bed with them. His son-in-law is in bed with them. This is outrageous, absolutely outrageous. I don't get it.
Lee, is that your
think?
point? That
That's
it's outrageous,
it.
or did you want to ask another question? Okay.
No, that's it.
Yeah, it's outrageous. Got it.
Okay. I mean, look, I was in Russia when Vladimir Putin became president. I wrote long features about how horrible he was back then. I knew exactly who he was. I knew where he came from. I was colleagues with reporters who were subsequently disappeared, people like Anna Politkovskaya and Yuri Shikachikhin, people who are dead today, because they didn't get along with the Putin regime. No one is more sensitive than me to the iniquity of Vladimir Putin's Russia. I'm totally aware of that. I think that it's a little bit of a stretch, though, to say that. Let me just say put it this way: 4 years ago, when Barack Obama was debating Mitt Romney on television, and Romney said that Russia was the biggest threat facing the world, Barack Obama said the 80s want their foreign policy back, and he suggested that, look, Russia is what it is, but it's probably better for us to get along or find some way to not be completely hostile enemies with them than to go back to what it was in the past. And I think that there's some merit to that. Look, we're two nuclear powers. What happened in Syria was an incredibly dangerous thing. When Trump was lobbing missiles into Syria, and there are Russian forces on the ground there. I mean, that's a very, very tense situation. That's the thing that I worry about most of all with the Trump administration is nuclear war. And Russia is what it is. You don't have to agree with it. I don't like the regime there. I've never liked the regime there, but we're probably better off not in a constant state of hostility with Russia than we are in one. At least that's my experience. And of course, if you ask Russians about what their view of Americans is, they will have almost exactly the same things to say about us. For instance, if you think about the 1996 election, which I was also there for in Russia, we openly meddled in that election. We sent advisors to the Boris Yeltsin campaign. If you look at Time magazine in July of 1996, there's a picture of Boris Yeltsin, and there's a headline that says "Yanks to the rescue," because we openly bragged about how we helped him win re-election, and the Russians still resent that stuff. So there's angst on both sides, and yes, it's a terrible regime. Yes, it's a third world regime, and they abuse journalists, and they crack down on all kinds of freedoms, and they support awful regimes, and that's who they are. But we're better off not at war with them than we are at war with them.
Tyler in East Lansing, Michigan, home of Michigan State, emails in, I was pleased to see you discussing Jonathan Haidt's very important book, The Righteous Mind. In that spirit, what do you see as conservatives' best point, and what do you see as their biggest shortcoming?
The best point of conservatives?
Yes, and their biggest shortcoming, or a best point, a shortcoming, if that's easier, rather than putting you on the spot for the best.
I mean, I think there's a complaint out there in conservative America that that the liberal mind and liberal media has become more orthodox and unaccepting of ideas and more hostile. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think that you know, from their point of view, from conservatives' point of view, what they would say is liberals run Hollywood, they run the media, they run campuses, and we see our world being taken over, and that's why we're so angry. And I'm not sure that you know, that it's a completely invalid point of view. I think that there's some truth to the fact that you know, the conservative point of view is often excluded automatically. You know, do I agree with it? No, but you know, I think that it does happen. But you know, in terms of their weakest point of view, just take that caller before who was talking about how, you know, the black and Hispanic people are the root of all evil. I mean, I think that kind of talk has become increasingly normalized in especially the kind of fringe conservative media, and the stuff that you see on a lot of those sites now is scary to me, frankly.
A couple of Facebook comments. Let's take them in order. This is Harley. Enjoyed you on IMUS. I would like to know if you think Trump can really make a difference in fighting global terror bombings, including the recent stuff going on in England.
I don't think so. I think Trump is uniquely unsuited to deal with the terrorism problem. I think it's a problem of enormous complexity. It requires somebody who has a profound knowledge of all the different relationships and historical grievances of in the region, in the Middle East. I think you need to have somebody who knows the difference between Egypt and Yemen, and between the Shiites and the Sunnis, and you know, and Donald Trump doesn't know the difference between any of that stuff. It's just all one big area that needs to be bombed to him, you know. And I think that's been a failing of American foreign policy, is our unwillingness to kind of learn about what's going on in that part of the world. It was a problem when we invaded Iraq, frankly, you know, that we had this incredibly simplistic idea that we were going to go in there and the tanks were going to roll in and it was going to be Switzerland 6 weeks later, you know, and this great flowering of Western values was going to take place. And we did that because we had no idea who these people were. We weren't interested in their point of view. And we didn't care about their history, their pride, and their culture, nothing. And, you know, so there are problems over there, but we're not going to solve it just by, like, shaking our fist and dropping bombs on it. I don't think that works.
Joseph Oppenheim posts on Facebook, Matt, the world is the most peaceful, prosperous, healthy, etc. This has coincided with the growth of capitalism, big banks, multinational companies, etc. Thus, aren't you naive to think that the little guy is being screwed?
I don't know. I mean, why don't you ask the little guy? I mean, I would say that incomes in this country real incomes have been declining steadily since 1970. You know, the inequality has grown at an enormous rate. You know, the top 1% of the country is making, you know, dozens of times what it was making relative to the rest of the country even 40 or 50 years ago. And yes, if you look at overall at the level of wealth in places like China, you might see a better standard of living, but in other parts of the world, we've seen other phenomena that are entirely negative, like the growth of inequality, like the collapse of sovereign nations in third world places in Africa. You know, we've just seen less order in the world in the last 30 or 40 years. So yeah, I understand that global capitalism has resulted in a lot of progress, but there are issues too, and those underlie frankly, a lot of the political grievances that are going on in the States these days.
Sean in Kaneohe, Hawaii, we have 1 minute left. Go ahead.
Aloha from Hawaii, the most cosmopolitan state in the Union. Matt, being Hawaiian Filipino, what's your favorite Hawaiian and Filipino food? And because you're a Rolling Stone writer, what's your favorite album or band? Aloha, mahalo.
Aloha, mahalo. I like halo halo, frankly, out of Filipino food.
What is that?
It's like this crazy ice cream-ish kind of thing. I don't even know how to explain it.
Okay.
My wife's Filipino also, so we eat you know, a little bit of Filipino food at home every now and then. So and Hawaiian food, I don't know. I've only been to Hawaii once, so you know, and I've never met my relatives there, as a matter of fact. So I'm ignorant as far as that goes. Albums, I have the worst musical taste in the world, and I'm too embarrassed to share my musical preferences with people on the air. So that's why they keep me away from music at Rolling Stone and never asked me to write about it.
Does it involve disco or the Bee Gees or anything?
No, I mean, I like rap music a lot, so, but I like everything, frankly. It's just that, you know, I think if the ordinary person heard what I listened to, they would think I was a real geek, more than they do now.
Have you noticed that your books over the years, this came out in the mid-aughts, Smells Like Dead Elephants, your name is down there at the bottom, but then this year, your name is great big letters. Have you noticed that at all, that your name is growing?
No, I hadn't thought about that. That's cool, though, I guess, right? Yeah.
All right. For the last 3 hours, Matt Taibbi has been our guest on Book TV's In-Depth program. Very quickly, here's a list of his books, beginning with The Exile, which came out in 2000. It's about sex, drugs, and libel in the new Russia. Spanking the Donkey, Dispatches from the Dumb Season, came out after the 2004 election. Smells Like Dead Elephants, Dispatches from a Rotting Empire, came out in 2007. The Great Derangement came out in 2009. Griftopia, a story of bankers, politicians, and the most audacious power grab in American history. 2011, The Divide, which Mr. Taibbi recommends as the book to pick up. American Injustice in the Age of the Wealth Gap came out in 2014. And his most recent book this year, Insane Clown President. Mr. Taibbi, thank you for your time on Book TV.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you.